the latitude of Thule or Iceland would be fixed at 66 degrees north, which corresponds with the north of Iceland, where the two tropics would join and become one. To the foregoing may be added another criticism on Strabo, which has an effect opposite to that intended as, and here we arrive at the Merkaba, which has an effect opposite to that intended as the, quote, marine sponge. Now they say it's nothing but soft ice which forms in the north, but it's described here by Pliny and Strabo as, where are we here? It is likewise he who describes Thule and other neighboring places where, according to him, neither earth, water, nor air exist separately, but a sort of concretion of all these resembling a marine sponge. Now, I don't know why they throw that in there, but let's just cut that out. So we'll start again. A place where, according to him, neither earth, water, nor air exist separately, but all together, as a sort of concretion of all these, in which the earth, the sea, and all things are suspended, thus forming, as it were, a link to unite the whole together. It can neither be traveled over nor sailed through.
Aloha and hallelujah. Welcome to the Hallelujah Show live, where we are uploading this new video selection. And don't forget to subscribe and share, like. We really appreciate that. That helps us in all the work we do. And you know, make sure to hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified whenever we have a new upload. And don't forget to check out our website, TheKazwehcom. We got blogs, we got information, we got products, and we got some cool stuff to offer this year. So thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoy.
So that they don't keep shutting us down. That's what we gotta do. We gotta fight the moles. We gotta cut these damn agents' heads off, man. That's what we about. So with that being said, may the divine force in me greet the divine force in you. Dua, 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 family. Peace. Ashe.
When you look at the Arctic, you know, it's the world's smallest ocean. There's very little known about it, and yet it's at the hub of all the world's great changes. The purpose of the expedition is to bring to light the value of remote regions in the sea. You name it, it's sort of represented here. I always look at the Arctic as a bit of a bellwether, the sort of canary in the cage in the mine, letting us know what's happening in the rest of the world.
Franz Josef Land itself has this compelling story. It's a place where the biological diversity is not that high. You can go to the South Pole, you can go to Antarctica, you can find rock and ice again. You won't find polar bears there, you won't find little auks there, you won't find ivory gulls there. It's important to preserve it because it is an entire intact ecosystem that's not duplicated anywhere on this planet, and for all we know, anywhere in the universe. Some people admire medical missionaries, some people admire astronauts or cowboys. I admire field biologists. They are tough people. They're tough physically and they're tough intellectually. What they do is very important and very interesting.
This place is melting like a popsicle in Arizona in the summertime. You know, it's going very, very fast.
And within all of our lifetimes, the Arctic will be unrecognizable. So this expedition is setting out a high standard, top quality baseline, which isn't just focused on climate and sea ice, but it's focused across the whole food chain.
Protecting the waters around Franz Josef Land is important because the entire ecosystem depends on the ocean.
Up here is a true wilderness, where I can experience the sense of freedom, the sense of dreams and possibilities, and the sense of engaging with nature. That adds to my lifestyle. And let's think about it. There are now 7.1 billion of us. We all need to reconnect with the wilderness. It's incredibly essential. It's the human condition. We do need the wilderness. It's in us. We're human. We are part of nature. There aren't many true wildernesses left. And I feel, and indeed I hope, that in years to come, activities in the Arctic will be steered and sort of mentored in many ways by the success of this expedition.
Welcome back to Flatwater, guys. This is Atlantis Found. Today, we're going to pick up where we left off most recently with some amazing finds. And we're going to tie it all together. So I've read to you from Mercator's work and Mercator's letter to John Dee, in which he talks about the peoples at the septentrional North Pole. Also, I've and others have pointed out the biblical references to the peoples at the pole in Eden, Meru, Shambhala, Asgard, Atlantis, and many of the other names that refer to the same place, our North Pole. So in this work, I'm going to combine quite a few of the main stories that talk about what it's like there, and how to get there, and what is found once you're there. So, we're going to begin. The earliest possible reference is either the Bible, Plato, and or the references that Zen brought up regarding the Thracian chronicles and Thracian lore, and that the Thracians did indeed come from the north. So this is also where our two works line up, is that I've been looking at other cultures that claim to come from Hyperborea and claim to come from the north. So a lot of the Scandinavian Gothic peoples, the Tartars, the Russians, the Egyptians who originally came from or turned back to the Coptics, and you can see how those cultures are all interrelated, moving south from north. And then on the other side we see China and Nepal and Shambhala, the Chinese versions of Eden, of Meru, and we'll get into some more of those later as well. But we see that on the eastern side, through Marco Polo and through his recollections to the courts of Europe, that the ancient Chinese had influenced the Aztecs and the Mexicans to have the same beliefs. And we can see that, in fact, early Aztec is actually mid to late Chinese and was influenced heavily by them on that side of the Americas, on the western side of the Americas. And we see that in their culture that they reference the same things about a place like Eden in the north, where all peoples originated from, where they have magic and powers and greatness and great abundance and wonderful weather and beautiful, good people, and also that all humans came from that place, and that it is still there, and that mere mortals are lucky to get there, if they can get there at all. So we're going to trace back through, and I'm going to read to you from runic inscriptions and ancient Scandinavian wood carvings of their ancient lore, also ancient Latin, and Plato and Pliny, and Plato's natural history, and also will be reading from, or Olaf Jensen will be reading from his tale of his journey to the north and what he discovered there. And we're also going to read from letters written from an English sailor to his brother in the early 1800s and his descriptions of what it was like there and what he saw there. Hyperborea. We're going to start with Olaf Jensen's story and interject the important information, and later we'll backtrack and tie together the whole story. Now, this material is commonly found in hollow earth material. We will see that this information may pertain, there may be a place and places inside the earth that we can reach at the North Pole. It could be any number of things. There could be that there is atop Mount Meru, a godly place. There could be that inside of the earth there is a place with a tower still sticking straight out the top of it, which would be Mount Meru. And I don't prescribe to the hollow earth in the standard hollow earth model. What I'm proposing here is that we are living on the flat earth, and that the vortex at the pole, the foaming whirlpool that goes there, and that the in-sucking rivers and seas go down to there, that it might be possible to somehow get inside the earth there safely, and that inside of that area there may be a secondary living area that other cultures and ancient cultures have been living in since the beginning of time, as is stated in all of these readings that we're doing. So, just so you understand the premise of what it's like in that area. My name is Olaf Jensen. I am a Norwegian, although I was born in the little seafaring Russian town of Uleaborg on the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic Sea. My parents were on a fishing cruise in the Gulf of Bothnia and put into this Russian town of Uleaborg at the time of my birth, being the 27th day of October, 1811. My father, Jens Jensen, was born at Rodwig on the Scandinavian coast near the Lofoten Islands, but after marrying made his home at Stockholm, because my mother's people resided in that city. When 7 years old, I began going with my father on his fishing trips along the Scandinavian coast. Early in life, I displayed an aptitude for books, and at the age of 9 years was placed in a private school in Stockholm, remaining there till I was 14. After this, I made regular trips with my father on all his fishing voyages. My father was a man fully 6 feet 3 in height, and weighed over 15 stone, a typical Norseman of the most rugged sort, and capable of more endurance than any other man I have ever known. He possessed the gentleness of a woman in tender little ways, yet his determination and willpower were beyond description. His will admitted of no defeat. I was in my 19th year when we started on what proved to be our last trip as fishermen, and which resulted in a strange story that shall be given to the world, but not until I have finished my earthly pilgrimage. I dare not allow the facts as I know them to be published while I'm alive, for fear of further humiliation, confinement, and suffering. First of all, I was put in irons by the captain of the whaling vessel that rescued me, for no other reason than that I told the truth about the marvelous discoveries made by my father and myself. But this was far from being the end of my tortures. After 4 years and 8 months' absence, I reached Stockholm, only to find my mother had died the previous year, and the property left by my parents in the possession of my mother's people, but it was at once made over to me. All might have been well, had I erased from my memory the story of our adventure and of my father's terrible death. Finally, one day, I told the story in detail to my uncle, Gustav Osterland, a man of considerable property, and urged him to fit out an expedition for me to make another voyage to the strange land. At first I thought he favored my project. He seemed interested, and invited me to go before certain officials and explain to them, as I had to him, the story of our travels and discoveries. Imagine my disappointment and horror when, upon the conclusion of my narrative, certain papers were signed by my uncle, and without warning, I found myself arrested and hurried away to dismal and fearful confinement in a madhouse, where I remained for 28 years, long, tedious, frightful years of suffering. I never ceased to assert my sanity, and to protest against the injustice of my confinement. Finally, on the 17th of October 1862, I was released. My uncle was dead and the friends of my youth were now strangers. Indeed, a man over 50 years old whose only known record is that of a madman has no friends. I was at a loss to know what to do for a living, but instinctively turned toward the harbor where fishing boats in great numbers were anchored, and within a week I had shipped with a fisherman by the name of Jan Hansen, who was starting on a long fishing cruise to the Lofoten Islands. Here my earlier years of training proved of the very greatest advantage, especially in enabling me to make myself useful. This was but the beginning of other trips, and by frugal economy I was, in a few years, able to own a fishing brig of my own. For 27 years thereafter I followed the sea as a fisherman, 5 years working for others, and the last 22 for myself. During all these years I was a most diligent student of books, as well as a hard worker at my business. But I took great care not to mention to anyone the story concerning the discoveries made by my father and myself. Even at this late day I would be fearful of having anyone see or know the things I am writing, and the records and maps I have in my keeping. When my days on earth are finished, I shall leave maps and records that will enlighten, and I hope benefit, mankind. The memory of my long confinement with maniacs, and all the horrible anguish and sufferings are too vivid to warrant my taking further chances. In 1889 I sold out my fishing boats, and found I had accumulated a fortune quite sufficient to keep me the remainder of my life. I then came to America. For a dozen years my home was in Illinois, near Batavia, where I gathered most of the books in my present library, though I bought many choice volumes from Stockholm. Later I came to Los Angeles, arriving here March 4, 1901. The date I well remember, as it was President McKinley's second inauguration that day. I bought this humble home and determined here in the privacy of my own abode, sheltered by my own vine and fig tree, and with my books about me to make maps and drawings of the new lands we had discovered, and also to write the story in detail from the time my father and I left Stockholm until the tragic event that parted us in the Antarctic Ocean, or in the Arctic Ocean. I well remember that we left Stockholm in our fishing sloop on the 3rd day of April 1829, and sailed to the southward, leaving Gotland Island to the left and Åland Island to the right. A few days later we succeeded in doubling Sandhomar Point, and made our way through the Sound, which separates Denmark from the Scandinavian coast. In due time we put in at a town of Kristiansand, where we rested 2 days, and then started round the Scandinavian coast to the westward, bound for the Lofoten Islands. My father was in high spirit because of the excellent and gratifying returns he had received from our last catch by marketing at Stockholm, instead of selling at one of the seafaring towns along the Scandinavian coast. He was especially pleased with the sale of some ivory tusks that he had found on the west coast of Franz Josef Land during one of his northern cruises the previous year, and he expressed the hope that this time we might again be fortunate enough to load our little fishing sloop with ivory, instead of cod, herring, mackerel, and salmon. We put in at Hammerfest, latitude 71 degrees and 40 minutes, for a few days' rest. Here we remained 1 week, laying in an extra supply of provisions and several casks of drinking water, and then sailed towards Spitzbergen. For the first few days we had an open sea and favoring wind, and then we encountered much ice and many icebergs. A vessel larger than our little fishing sloop could not possibly have threaded its way among the labyrinth of icebergs, or squeezed through the barely open channels. These monster bergs presented an endless succession of crystal palaces, massive cathedrals, and fantastic mountain ranges, grim and sentinel-like, immovable as some towering cliff of solid rock, standing silently as sphinx, resisting the restless waves of a fretful sea. After many narrow escapes, we arrived at Spitzbergen on the 23rd of June, and anchored at Wyjade Bay for a short time, where we were quite successful in our catches. We then lifted anchor and sailed through the Hinlopen Strait, and coasted along the northeast land, inset 2. It will be remembered that Andre started on his fatal balloon voyage from the northwest coast of Spitzbergen. So several times during this, we'll interject with notes, side notes. They started along the Hinlopen Strait and coasted along the northeast land. A strong wind came up from the southwest, and my father said that we had better take advantage of it and try to reach Franz Josef Land, where the year before he had by accident found the ivory tusks that had brought him such a good price at Stockholm. Never before or since have I seen so many seafowl. They were so numerous that they hid the rocks on the coastline and darkened the sky. For several days we sailed along the rocky coast of Franz Josef Land. Finally a favoring wind came up that enabled us to make the west coast, and after sailing 24 hours, we came to a beautiful inlet. One could hardly believe it was the north end. The place was green with growing vegetation, for while the area did not comprise more than 1 or 2 acres, yet the air was warm and tranquil. It seemed to be at that point where the Gulf Stream's influence is most keenly felt. And inset, Sir John Barrow Bart, in his work entitled Voyages of Discovery, and Research within the Arctic Regions, says on page 57, Mr. Beachy refers to what has frequently been found and noticed, the mildness of the temperature on the western coast of Spitsbergen, there being little or no sensation of cold, though the thermometer might be only a few degrees above the freezing point. The brilliant and lively effect of a clear day, when the sun shines forth with a pure sky, whose azure hue is so intense as to find no parallel even in the boasted Italian sky. And we'll note in the other documents that we'll get to that they talk about the same thing, that once they reach a certain distance north, that it ceases to become so cold. On the east coast there were numerous icebergs, yet here we were in open water. Far to the west of us, however, were ice packs, and still farther to the westward the ice appeared like ranges of low hills. In front of us and directly to the north lay an open sea. Captain Kane on page 299, quoting from Morton's journal, 26 December, says, as far as I could see, the open passages were 15 miles or more wide, with sometimes mashed ice separating them. But it is all small ice, and I think it either drives out to the open space to the north or rots and sinks, as I could see none ahead to the north. And we'll notice that in the other portions where this is the main hindrance to travelers trying to get there, that it's the ice pack. Its early onset in winter and its late leaving in the summer makes it there's very little time where you can safely get through the ice pack and get to the actual area of the pole. So it would be known, that's why it's known as the land beyond the north. And we'll get into later the actual, and you'll see it here as we go through in the photos, you'll see the actual route that these people took to get there, through the northern parts of Canada, or Scandinavia, or Russia. My father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor, and had frequently told me they were gods who came from far beyond the north wind. There was a tradition, my father explained, that still farther northward was a land more beautiful than that any mortal had ever known, and that it was inhabited by the chosen. We find the following in Dutch mythology, page 778, from the pen of Jacob Grimm. Then the sons of Bor, as in Borea, or Hyperbore, built in the middle of the universe the city called Asgard, where dwell the gods and their kindred, and from that abode work out so many wondrous things, both on the earth and in the heavens above it. There is in that city a place called Hidskalf, and when Odin is seated there, upon his lofty throne, he sees over the whole world, and discerns all the actions of men. My youthful imagination was fired by the ardor, zeal, and religious fervor of my good father, and I exclaimed, why not sail to this goodly land? The sky is fair, the wind favorable, and the sea open. From Plato. He is the God who sits in the center, on the navel of the earth, and he is the interpreter of religion to all mankind. Plato. And we'll be reading from Plato later as well. Even now I can see the expression of pleasurable surprise on his countenance, as he turned toward me and asked, my son, are you willing to go with me and explore? To go far beyond, where man has ever ventured? I answered affirmatively. Very well, he replied. May the god Odin protect us. And, quickly adjusting the sails, he glanced at our compass, turned the prow in due northerly direction through an open channel, and our voyage had begun. Hall writes on page 288, on 23rd January, the two Eskimo, accompanied by two of the seamen, went to Cape Lepton. They reported a sea of open water extending as far as the eye could reach. The sun was low in the horizon, as it was still the early summer. Indeed, we had almost 4 months of day ahead of us before the frozen night could come on again. Our little fishing sloop sprang forward, as if eager as ourselves for adventure. Within 36 hours we were out of sight of the highest point on the coastline of Franz Josef Land. We seemed to be in a strong current running north by northeast. Far to the right and to the left of us were icebergs, but our little sloop bore down on the narrows and passed through channels and out into open seas, channels so narrow in places that, had our craft been other than small, we could never have gotten through. On the third day we came to an island. Its shores were washed by an open sea. My father determined to land and explore for a day. This new land was destitute of timber, but we found a large accumulation of driftwood on the northern shore. Some of the trunks of the trees were 40 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. Greeley tells us in Volume 1, page 1, that Privates Connell and Frederick found a large coniferous tree on the beach just above the extreme high water mark. It was nearly 30 inches in circumference, some 30 feet long, and had apparently been carried to that point by a current within a couple of years. A portion of it was cut up for firewood, and for the first time in that valley, a bright, cheery campfire gave comfort to man. After one day's exploration of the coast of this land, we lifted anchor and turned our prow to the north in an open sea.
Dr. Kane says on page 379, I cannot imagine what becomes of the ice. A strong current sets in constantly to the north, but from altitudes of more than 500 feet, I saw only narrow strips of ice, with great spaces of open water, from 10 to 15 miles in breadth, between them. It must therefore either go to an open space in the north, or dissolve. I remember that neither my father nor myself had tasted food for almost 30 hours. Perhaps this was because of the tension of excitement about our strange voyage in waters farther north. My father said, than anyone had ever been before. Active mentality had dulled the demands of the physical needs. Instead of the cold being intense as we had anticipated, it was really warmer and more pleasant than it had been while in Hammerfest on the north coast of Norway some 6 weeks before. Captain Peary's second voyage relates another circumstance which may serve to confirm a conjecture which has long been maintained by some, that an open sea free of ice exists at our near pole. On the 2nd of November, says Peary, the wind freshened up to a gale from north by west, lowered the thermometer before midnight to 5 degrees, whereas a rise of wind at Melville Island was generally accompanied by a simultaneous rise in the thermometer at low temperatures. May not this, he asks, be occasioned by the wind blowing over an open sea in the quarter from which the wind blows, and tend to confirm the opinion that at or near the pole an open sea exists? And this is what ties in with the other reading that I've done, but I've been having problems with my software, so the other reading is not ready yet. But this is letters from a sailor who attended a royal expedition to the North Pole in the early 1800s, the 1820s, and he writes letters continually to his brother while he's away. And during those writings, he continually, in every letter, he gives constant bearings. He gives his constant latitude and longitude. And as they move up from the 60th, 65th, 70th, 75th parallel, and they get up into the 80th and get right up there to the North Pole, and as they're moving westward, they move across the 90th, 95th, 100th, 103rd degree of longitude. And he keeps talking about where he is. And Melville Island is a place in Canada, and there's pictures of it here in this document, or in this show that you'll see, where it's the channels with the boats in the north. And that's Melville Island. It looks like a giant rock, a barren rock. And so you see that there's places there where it's incredibly barren and ice-filled up in the islands. And then there's other places where there are trees. It's supposed to be past the Krummholz zone, where trees don't grow anymore. And we'll get into some other interesting things that happen at those latitudes, such as the magnetic dip of the needle. So back to the Hollow Earth story by Jensen. So we were on about Captain Peary, and there's an open sea near the North Pole. We both frankly admitted that we were very hungry, and forthwith I prepared a substantial meal from our well-stored larder. When we had partaken heartily of the repast, I told my father I believed I would sleep, as I was beginning to feel quite drowsy. Very well, he replied, I will keep the watch. I have no way to determine how long I slept. I only know that I was rudely awakened by a terrible commotion of the sloop. To my surprise, I found my father sleeping soundly. I cried out lustily to him, and starting up, he sprang quickly to his feet. Indeed, had he not instantly clutched the rail, he would certainly have been thrown into the seething waves. A fierce snowstorm was raging. The wind was directly astern, driving our sloop at a terrific speed, and was threatening every moment to capsize us. There was no time to lose. The sails had to be lowered immediately. Our boat was writhing in convulsions. A few icebergs we knew were on either side of us, but fortunately the channel was open directly to the north. But would it remain so? In front of us, girding the horizon from left to right, was a vaporish fog or mist, black as Egyptian night at the water's edge, and white like a steam cloud toward the top, which was finally lost to view as it blended with the great white flakes of falling snow. Whether it covered a treacherous iceberg, or some other hidden obstacle against which our little sloop would dash and send us to a watery grave, or it was merely the phenomenon of an Arctic fog, there was no way to determine. On the page 284 of his works, Hall writes, from the top of Providence Berg, a dark fog was seen to the north, indicating water. At 10 a.m., 3 of the men, Kruger, Nindemann, and Hobby, went to Cape Lupton to ascertain, if possible, the extent of the open water. On their return, they reported several open spaces and much young ice, not more than a day old, so thin that it was easily broken by throwing pieces of ice upon it. By what miracles we escaped being dashed to utter destruction, I do not know. I remember our little craft creaked and groaned as if joints were breaking. It rocked and staggered to and fro as if clutched by some fierce undertow of whirlpool or maelstrom. Fortunately, our compass had been fastened with long screws to a crossbeam. Most of our provisions, however, were tumbled out and swept away from the deck of the cuddy, and had we not taken the precaution at the very beginning to tie ourselves firmly to the mast of the sloop, we should have been swept into the lashing sea. Above the deafening tumult of the raging waves, I heard my father's voice. "Be courageous, my son," he shouted. "Odin is the god of the waters, the companion of the brave, and he is with us. Fear not." To me it seemed there was no possibility of our escaping a horrible death. The little sloop was shipping water. The snow was falling so fast as to be blinding, and the waves were tumbling over our counters in reckless white-sprayed fury. There was no telling what instant we should be dashed against some drifting ice pack. The tremendous swells would heave us up to the very peaks of mountainous waves, and then plunge us down again into the depths of the sea's trough, as if our fishing sloop were a fragile shell. Gigantic white-capped waves like veritable walls fenced us in, fore and aft. This terrible, nerve-wracking ordeal, with its nameless horrors of suspense and agony of fear, indescribable, continued for more than 3 hours, and all the time we were being driven forward at fierce speed. Then suddenly, as if growing weary of its frantic exertions, the wind began to lessen its fury, and by degrees to die down. At last we were in perfect calm. The fog mist had also disappeared, and before us lay an iceless channel perhaps 10 or 15 miles wide, with a few icebergs far away to our right, and an intermittent archipelago of smaller ones to the left. I watched my father closely, determined to remain silent until he spoke. Presently he untied the rope from his waist and, without saying a word, began working the pumps, which fortunately were not damaged, relieving the sloop of the water it had shipped in the madness of the storm. He put up the sloop's sails as calmly as if casting a fishing net, and then remarked that we were ready for a favoring wind when it came. His courage and persistence were truly remarkable. On investigation we found less than 1/3 of our provisions remaining, while, to our utter dismay, we discovered that our water casks had been swept overboard during the violent plungings of our boat. 2 of our water casks were in the main hold, both were empty. We had a fair supply of food, but no fresh water. I realized at once the awfulness of our position, and presently I was seized with a consuming thirst. "It is indeed bad," remarked my father. "Let us dry our bedraggled clothing, for we are soaked to the skin. Trust to the god, Odin, my son. Do not give up hope." The sun was beating down slantingly, as if we were in a southern latitude, instead of in the far northland. It was swinging around, its orbit ever visible and rising higher and higher each day, frequently mist-covered, yet always peering through the lacework of clouds like some fretful eye of fate, guarding the mysterious northland and jealously watching the pranks of man. Far to our right, the rays decking the prisms of icebergs were gorgeous. Their reflections emitted flashes of garnet, of diamond, of sapphire, a pyrotechnic panorama of countless colors and shapes, while below could be seen the green-tinted sea, and above, the purple sky. Beyond the north. I tried to forget my thirst by busying myself with bringing up some food in an empty vessel from the hold. Reaching over the side rail, I filled the vessel with water for the purpose of laving my hands and face. To my astonishment, when the water came in contact with my lips, I could taste no salt. I was startled by the discovery. "Father," I fairly gasped. The water, it is fresh." "What, Olaf?" exclaimed my father, glancing hastily around. "Surely you are mistaken. There is no land. You are going mad." "But taste it," I cried. And thus we made the discovery that the water was indeed fresh, absolutely so, without the least briny taste or even the suspicion of a salty flavor. We forthwith filled our 2 remaining water casks, and my father declared it was a heavenly dispensation of mercy from the gods, Odin and Thor. We were almost beside ourselves with joy, but hunger bade us end our enforced fast. Now that we had found fresh water in the open sea, what might we not expect in this strange latitude, where ship had never before sailed, and the splash of an oar had never been heard? In Volume 1, page 195, Nansen writes, "It is a peculiar phenomenon, this dead water. We had at present a better opportunity of studying it than we desired. It occurs where a surface layer of fresh water rests upon the salt water of the sea, and this fresh water is carried along with the ship, gliding on the heavier sea beneath it, as if on a fixed foundation. The difference between 2 strata was in this case so great that while we had drinking water on the surface, the water we got from the bottom cock of the engine room was far too salt to be used for the boiler." And so this is what I wanted to mention as well about the other traveler at Melville Island, and what he writes in his travels as well, and it comes up in all kinds of Arctic travels, that the icebergs are not salty, and science will tell you that it is frozen ocean that makes icebergs. But go ahead and take some water at your house and put a bunch of salt in it. Mix it thoroughly, stir it thoroughly till you have a good solution, and put it in your deep freezer. And see if your deep freezer pushes the salt out of the ice, as they say that it does, or if it just freezes into a chunk of salt ice. And we'll get into this further, that they're using the water from the glaciers to drink from, and it is perfectly clean, and that it can't be frozen seawater. So where is it coming from? And in such abundance. Back to the text. We had scarcely appeased our hunger when a breeze began filling the idle sails, and glancing at the compass, we found the northern point pressing hard against the glass. In response to my surprise, my father said, "I have heard of this before. It is what they call the dipping of the needle." We loosened the compass and turned it at right angles with the surface of the sea before its point would free itself from the glass and point accordingly to unmolested attraction. It shifted uneasily and seemed as unsteady as a drunken man, but finally pointed a course. Before this, we thought the wind was carrying us north by northwest, but with the needle free, we discovered, if it could be relied upon, that we were sailing slightly north by northeast. Our course, however, was ever tending northward. In Volume 2, pages 18 and 19, Nansen also writes about the inclination of the needle. Speaking of Johnson, his aide, "One day, it was November 24th, he came in to supper a little after 6, quite alarmed, and said, 'There has just been a singular inclination of the needle in 24 degrees, and remarkably enough, its northern extremity pointed to the east.'" And we also see this in the Melville Island texts, that they had the same occurrence. And lots of other sailors remark that around that area, around the 75th parallel, 75 latitude and 103 to 105, or I should say 99 to 105 in longitude, that in that area that the compass begins to waver drastically. We again find in Peary's first voyage, page 67, the following. "It had been observed that from the moment they had entered Lancaster Sound, the motion of the compass needle was very sluggish, and both this and its deviation increased as they progressed to the westward, and continued to do so in descending this inlet. Having reached latitude 73 degrees, they witnessed for the first time the curious phenomenon of the directive power of the needle becoming so weak as to be completely overcome by the attraction of the ship, so that the needle might now be said to point to the north pole of the ship. The sea was serenely smooth, with hardly a choppy wave, and the wind brisk and exhilarating." So, before we carry on, I'll add to that as well. During the Melville Island expeditions, those sailors, what they would do is get off of their ship and actually go onto the ice or onto the land into a place that was suitable where there was limited magnetic disturbance from other sources. So they learned after a very short time that they needed to get away from any other iron objects and to get a true bearing. And even still, in those locations, they would have major problems. The sea was serenely smooth, with hardly a choppy wave, and the wind brisk and exhilarating. The sun's rays, while striking us aslant, furnished tranquil warmth, and thus time wore on day after day, and we found from the record in our logbook we had been sailing 11 days since the storm in the open sea. By strictest economy, our food was holding out fairly well, but beginning to run low. In the meantime, one of our casks of water had been exhausted, and my father said, "We will fill it again." But to our dismay, we found the water was now as salt as in the region of the Lofoten Islands off the coast of Norway. This necessitated our being extremely careful of the remaining cask. I found myself wanting to sleep much of the time, whether it was the effect of the exciting experience of sailing in unknown waters, or the relaxation from the awful excitement incident to our adventure in a storm at sea, or due to want of food, I could not say. I frequently lay down in the bunker of our little sloop, and looked far up into the blue dome of the sky, and notwithstanding, the sun was shining far away in the east, I always saw a single star overhead. For several days, when I looked for the star, it was always there directly above us. It was now, according to our reckoning, about the 1st of August. The sun was high in the heavens, and was so bright that I could no longer see the lone star that attracted my attention a few days earlier. One day, about this time, my father startled me by calling my attention to a novel sight far in front of us, almost at the horizon. "It is a mock sun," exclaimed my father. "I have read of them. It is called a reflection or mirage, and it will soon pass away." But this dull red false sun, as we supposed it to be, did not pass away for several hours, and while we were unconscious of its emitting any rays of light, Still, there was no time thereafter when we could not sweep the horizon in front and locate the illumination of the so-called false sun, during a period of at least 12 hours out of every 24. Clouds and mists would at times almost, but never entirely, hide its location. Gradually it seemed to climb higher in the horizon of the uncertain purple sky as we advanced. It could hardly be said to resemble the sun, except in its circular shape, and when not obscured by clouds or the ocean mists, it had a hazy red bronzed appearance, which would change to a white, like a luminous cloud, as if reflecting some greater light beyond. We finally agreed in our discussion of this smoky furnace-colored sun that, whatever the cause of the phenomena, it was not a reflection of our sun, but a planet of some sort, a reality. Nansen, on page 394, says, "Today another noteworthy thing happened, which was that about midday we saw the sun, or to be more correct, an image of the sun, for it was only a mirage. A peculiar impression was produced by the sight of that glowing fire lit just above the outermost edge of the ice. According to the enthusiastic descriptions given by many Arctic travelers of the first appearance of this god of life after the long winter night, the impression ought to be one of jubilant excitement. But it was not so in my case. We had not expected to see it for some days yet, so that my feeling was rather one of pain, of disappointment, that we must have drifted farther south than we ought. So, it was with pleasure I soon discovered that it could not be the sun itself. The mirage was at first a flattened-out, glowing red streak of fire on the horizon, and later there were two streaks, the one above the other, with a dark space between, and from the main top I could see 4 or even 5 such horizontal lines directly over one another, all of equal length, as if one could imagine a square, dull red sun with horizontal dark streaks across it, or the northern lights is what I would add. One day, soon after this, I felt exceedingly drowsy, and fell into a sound sleep, but it seemed that I was almost immediately aroused by my father's vigorous shaking of me by the shoulder and saying, "Olaf, awaken! There is land in sight!" I sprang to my feet, and oh joy! Joy unspeakable! There, far in the distance, yet directly in our path, were lands jutting boldly into the sea. The shoreline stretched far away to the right of us, as far as the eye could see, and all along the sandy beach were waves breaking into choppy foam, receding and then going forward again, ever chanting in monotonous thunder tones the song of the deep. The banks were covered with trees and vegetation. I cannot express my feeling of exultation at this discovery. My father stood motionless, with his hand on the tiller, looking straight ahead, pouring out his heart in thankful prayer and thanksgiving to the gods, Odin and Thor. In the meantime, a net which we found in the stowage had been cast, and we caught a few fish that materially added to our dwindling stock of provisions. The compass, which we had fastened back in its place in fear of another storm, was still pointing due north and moving on its pivot, just as it had in Stockholm. The dipping of the needle had ceased. What could this mean? Then, too, our many days of sailing had certainly carried us far past the North Pole, and yet the needle continued to point north. We were sorely perplexed, for surely our direction was now south. Peary's first voyage, page 69, says, "On reaching Sir Byam Martin's Island, or Byam Martin's Island, the nearest to Melville, the latitude of the place of observation was 75 degrees 9 minutes and 23 seconds, and the longitude 103 degrees 44 minutes 37 seconds. The dip of the magnetic needle of 88 degrees 25 minutes 58 seconds west, and the longitude of 91 degrees 48 minutes, where the last observations on the shore had been made, to 165 degrees 50 minutes and 9 seconds east, at their present station, so that we had, says Peary, in sailing over the space included between these two meridians, crossed immediately northward of the magnetic pole, and had undoubtedly passed over one of those spots upon the globe where the needle would have to be found to vary 180 degrees, or in other words, where the North Pole would have pointed to the south." So obviously I think they're just very confused there. We sailed for 3 days along the shoreline, then came to the mouth of a fjord or river of immense size. It seemed more like a great bay, and into this we turned our fishing craft, the direction being slightly northeast of south. By the assistance of a fretful wind that came to our aid about 12 hours out of every 24, we continued to make our way inland into what afterward proved to be a mighty river, and which we learned was called by the inhabitants Hiddekel, or Hiddekel. So interesting that they came to the mouth of a mighty river. We continued our journey for 10 days thereafter, and found we had fortunately attained a distance inland where ocean tides no longer affected the water, which had become fresh. The discovery came none too soon, for our remaining cask of water was well nigh exhausted. We lost no time in replenishing our casks, and continued to sail farther up the river when the wind was favorable. So something I want to mention here. I think a lot of people think that as you get up to the North Pole, that the way that the maps are, and the way that it looks on Earth, that it looks like it's a very tiny area. When in reality, if you consider the size of things like Lake Ontario or other large bodies, which are really, on a map, quite tiny bodies, They are tremendous size areas of water. You could be out on them and think that you're out on an ocean. You could be out and not see land for days or weeks, just like you're on the ocean. And so within the interior of the pole there, at the part where the rivers rush into that inner sea, that northern inner sea could be a huge body of water. And you would have, being a sailor, not knowing where you are there, you would easily still think that you're out on the main ocean. The discovery came none too soon. All the banks, great forests miles in extent, could be seen stretching away on the shoreline. The trees were of enormous size. We landed after anchoring near a sandy beach and waded ashore, and were rewarded by finding a quantity of nuts that were very palatable and satisfying to hunger, and a welcome change from the monotony of our stock of provisions. So they found food there. It was about the 1st September, over 5 months we calculated, since our leave-taking from Stockholm. Suddenly we were frightened almost out of our wits by hearing in the far distance the singing of people. Very soon thereafter we discovered a huge ship gliding down the river directly toward us. Those aboard were singing in one mighty chorus that, echoing from bank to bank, sounded like 1,000 voices, filling the whole universe with quivering melody. The accompaniment was played on stringed instruments not unlike our harps. It was a larger ship than any we had ever seen and was differently constructed. Asiatic Mythology, Paradise Found, translation by Sayce in a book called Records of the Past, we are told of a dwelling which the gods created for the first human beings, a dwelling in which they become great and increased in numbers, and the location of which is described in words exactly corresponding to those of the Iranian, Indian, Chinese, Eddaic, and Aztec literature, namely, in the center of the earth. From Warren. At this particular time, our sloop was becalmed, and not far from the shore. The bank of the river, covered with mammoth trees, rose up several hundred feet in beautiful fashion. We seemed to be on the edge of some primeval forest that doubtless stretched far inland. The immense craft paused, and almost immediately a boat was lowered, and 6 men of gigantic stature rowed to our little fishing sloop. They spoke to us in a strange language. We knew from their manner, however, that they were not unfriendly. They talked a great deal among themselves, and one of them laughed immoderately, as though in finding us a queer discovery had been made. One of them spied our compass, and it seemed to interest them more than any other part of our sloop. Finally, the leader motioned as if to ask whether we were willing to leave our craft, to go on board their ship. "What say you, my son?" asked my father. "They cannot do any more than kill us." "They seem to be kindly disposed," I replied, "although what terrible giants. They must be the select 6 of the King's Crack Regiment. Just look at their great size." "We may as well go willingly as be taken by force," said my father, smiling, "for they are certainly able to capture us." Thereupon he made note by signs that we were ready to accompany them. Within a few minutes we were on board the ship, and a half an hour later our little fishing craft had been lifted bodily out of the water by a strange sort of hook and tackle, and set on board as a curiosity. There were several hundred people on board this, to us, mammoth ship, which we discovered was called the Naz, meaning, as we were afterward learned, pleasure, or to give a better interpretation, pleasure excursion ship. If my father and I were curiously observed by the ship's occupants, the strange race of giants offered us an equal amount of wonderment. Speaking of giants, in some of the other documents that I found, there is another new reference that I've never seen before, where there's a place in Europe, they dug up a giant's grave and actually found a 25-foot tall human with 10-foot wide shoulders. So later, at some point, I'll provide that reference. There was not a single man aboard who would not have been measured fully 12 feet in height. They all wore full beards, not particularly long, but seemingly short-cropped. They had mild and beautiful faces, exceedingly fair, with ruddy complexions. The hair and beard of some were black, others sandy, and still others yellow. The captain, as we designated the dignitary in command of the great vessel, was fully a head taller than any of his companions. The women averaged from 10 to 11 feet in height. Their features were especially regular and refined, while their complexion was of a most delicate tint heightened by a healthful glow. According to all procurable data, that spot at the era of man's appearance upon the stage was in the now lost Miocene continent, which then surrounded the Arctic Pole. That in that true original Eden, some of the early generations of men attained to a stature and longevity unequaled in any countries known to post-Diluvian history, is by no means scientifically incredible, William Warren, Paradise Found. Both men and women seemed to possess that particular ease of manner which we deem a sign of good breeding, and notwithstanding their huge statures, there was nothing about them suggesting awkwardness. As I was a lad in only my 19th year, I was doubtless looked upon as a true Tom Thumb. My father, 6'3", did not lift the top of his head above the waistline of these people. Each one seemed to vie with the others in extending courtesies and showing kindness to us. But all laughed heartily, I remember, when they had to improvise chairs for my father and myself to sit at table. They were richly attired in a costume peculiar to themselves and very attractive. The men were clothed in handsomely embroidered tunics of silk and satin, and belted at the waist. They wore knee breeches and stockings of a fine texture, while their feet were encased in sandals adorned with gold buckles. We early discovered that gold was one of the most common metals known, and that it was used extensively in decoration. Strange as it may seem, neither my father nor myself felt the least bit of solicitude for our safety. "We have come into our own," my father said to me. "This is the fulfillment of the tradition told me by my father and my father's father, and still back for many generations of our race. This is, assuredly, the land beyond the north wind." We seemed to make such an impression on the party, that we were given specially into the charge of one of the men, Jules Galdia, and his wife, for the purpose of being educated in their language, and we, on our part, were just as eager to learn as they were to instruct. At the captain's command, the vessel was swung cleverly about, and began retracing its course up the river. The machinery, while noiseless, was very powerful. The banks and trees on either side seemed to rush by. The ship's speed at times surpassed that of any railroad train on which I have ever ridden, even here in America. It was wonderful. In the meantime, we had lost sight of the sun's rays, but we found a radiance within, emanating from the dull red sun which had already attracted our attention, now giving out a white light, seemingly from a cloud bank far away in front of us. It dispensed a greater light, I should say, than 2 full moons on the clearest night. In 12 hours, this cloud of whiteness would pass out of sight as if eclipsed, and the 12 hours following corresponded with our night. We early learned that these strange people were worshippers of this great cloud of night. It was the smoky god of the inner world. The ship was equipped with a mode of illumination which I now presume was electricity, but neither my father nor myself at the time were sufficiently skilled in mechanics to understand whence came the power to operate the ship, or to maintain the soft, beautiful lights that answered the same purpose of our present methods of lighting the streets of our cities, our houses, and our places of business. It must be remembered, the time of which I write was the autumn of 1829, and we of the outside surface of the earth knew nothing then, so to speak, of electricity. The electricity surcharged condition of the air was a constant vitalizer. I never felt better in my life than during the 2 years my father and I sojourned on the inside of the earth. To resume my narrative of events, the ship on which we were sailing came to a stop 2 days after we had been taken on board. My father said as nearly as he could judge we were directly under Stockholm or London. The city we had reached was called Jehu, signifying a seaport town. The houses were largely and beautifully constructed, and quite uniform in appearance, yet without sameness. The principal occupation of the people appeared to be agriculture. The hillsides were covered with vineyards, while the valleys were devoted to the growing of grain. I never saw such a display of gold. It was everywhere. The door casings were inlaid, and the tables were veneered with sheetings of gold. Domes of the public buildings were of gold. It was used most generously in the finishings of the great temples of music. Vegetation grew in lavish exuberance, and fruit of all kinds possessed the most delicate flavor. Clusters of grapes 4 and 5 feet in length, each grape as large as an orange, and apples larger than a man's head, typified the wonderful growth of all things on the inside of the earth. The great redwood trees of California would be considered mere underbrush compared with the giant forest trees extending for miles and miles in all directions. In many directions along the foothills of the mountains, vast herds of cattle were seen during the last day of our travel on the river. So ordinarily when you're hearing this story, you'd be picturing, and the picture shown would be of a hollow ball earth, which is, it just looks and seems ludicrous, aside from our knowledge of the fact that the earth is flat. So while you're thinking of this and while you're watching, don't think of it as being in the inside of the ball. Think of it as that you've gone down inside of the earth, inside of caves inside the earth, and that this is where he's finding these things. We heard much of a city called Eden, but we were kept at Jehu for an entire year. By the end of that time we had learned to speak fairly well the language of this strange race of people. Our instructor, Jules Galdia, and his wife exhibited a patience that was truly commendable. One day an envoy from the ruler at Eden came to see us, and for 2 whole days my father and myself were put through a series of surprising questions. They wished to know from whence we came, what sort of people dwelt without, and what God we worshipped, our religious beliefs, the mode of living in our strange land, and 1,000 other things. The compass which we had brought with us attracted special attention. My father and I commented between ourselves on the fact that the compass still pointed north, although we now knew that we had sailed over the curve or over the edge of the Earth's aperture, and were far along southward on the inside of the surface of the Earth's crust. See, again, they just misunderstand where they were, which according to my father's estimate and my own is about 300 miles from the inside to the outside. It's no thicker than an eggshell. There's almost as much surface on the inside as the outside. The great luminous cloud, or a ball of dull red fire, fiery red in the mornings and evenings, and during the day giving off a beautiful white light, the smoky god, is seemingly suspended in the center of the great vacuum within the earth, and held to its place by the immutable law of gravitation, or a repellent atmospheric force, as the case may be. I refer to the known power that draws or repels with equal force in all directions. So again, at this time, they just don't understand what they're seeing, nor do I, if there's some sort of a light source down there. How am I to say how it functions? But we'll see later what this gets into. The base of this electrical cloud or central luminary, the seat of the gods, is dark and non-transparent, save for innumerable small openings, seemingly in the bottom of the great support or altar of the deity, upon which the smoky god rests, and the lights shining through these many openings twinkle at night in all their splendor, and seem to be stars, as natural as the stars we see shining when we're at home in Stockholm, excepting that they appear larger. The smoky god, therefore, with each daily revolution of the earth, appears to come up in the east and go down in the west, the same as our sun does, on the surface. In reality, the people within believe that the smoky god is the throne of their Jehovah, and is stationary, the effect of night and day, therefore, produced by the earth's daily rotation. So is that his interpretation or theirs? I've since discovered that the language of the people of the inner world is much like that of Sanskrit. After we had given an account of ourselves to the emissaries from the central seat of government of the inner continent, and my father had, in his crude way, drawn maps at their request of the outside surface, showing the divisions of land and water and giving the name of each of the continents, large islands, and the oceans, we were taken overland to the city of Eden, in a conveyance different from anything we have in Europe or America. This vehicle was doubtless some electrical contrivance. It was noiseless and ran on a single iron rail in perfect balance. The trip was made at a very high rate of speed. We were carried up hills and down dales, across valleys and along the sides of steep mountains, without any apparent attempt having been made to level the earth as we do for railroad tracks. We were taken overland to the city of Eden, in a conveyance different from anything we have in Europe or America. This vehicle was doubtless some electrical contrivance. It was noiseless and ran on a single iron rail in perfect balance. The trip was made at a very high rate of speed. We were carried up hills and down dales, across valleys and along the sides of steep mountains, without any apparent attempt having been made to level the earth as we do for railroad tracks. The car seats were huge yet comfortable affairs, and very high above the floor of the car. On the top of each car were high-geared flywheels lying on their sides, which were so automatically adjusted that, as the speed of the car increased, the high speed of these flywheels increased. We would see that this is exactly the same as the effect that a gyro would have, that it would hold the cart perfectly level. And that would perfectly suit what they're describing here. The surprise of my father and myself was indescribable when, amid the regal magnificence of a spacious hall, we were finally brought before the great high priest, ruler over all the land. He was richly robed and much taller than those about him, and could not have been less than 14 or 15 feet in height. The immense room in which we were received seemed finished in solid slabs of gold, thickly studded with jewels of amazing brilliancy. The city of Eden is located in what seems to be a beautiful valley. Yet, in fact, it is on the loftiest mountain plateau of the inner continent, several thousand feet higher than any portion of the surrounding country. It is the most beautiful place I have ever beheld in all my travels. In this elevated garden, all manner of fruits, vines, shrubs, trees, and flowers grow in riotous profusion. In this garden, 4 rivers have their source in a mighty artesian fountain. They divide and flow in 4 directions. This place is called by inhabitants the navel of the earth, or the beginning, the cradle of the human race. The names of the rivers are the Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel. And in other pieces, we'll see that the 4 rivers are named the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Gihon and the Pison. So carry on. And the Lord God planted a garden, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The book of Genesis. The unexpected awaited us in this palace of beauty, in the finding of our little fishing craft. It had been brought before the high priest in perfect shape, just as it had been taken from the waters that day when it was loaded on board the ship by the people who discovered us on the river more than a year before. We were given an audience of over 2 hours with this great dignitary, who seemed kindly disposed and considerate. He showed himself eagerly interested, asking us numerous questions and invariably regarding things about which his emissaries had failed to inquire. At the conclusion of the interview, he inquired our pleasure, asking us whether we wished to remain in his country or, if we were preferred, to return to the outer world, providing it were possible to make a successful return trip across the frozen belt barriers that encircle both the northern and southern openings of the earth. My father replied, "It would please me and my son to visit your country and see your people, your colleges and palaces of music and art, your great fields, your wonderful forests of timber, and after we have had this pleasurable privilege, we should like to try to return to our home on the outside of the earth. This son is my only child, and my good wife will be wearily waiting our return." "I fear you can never return," replied the high chief priest, "because the way is a most hazardous one. However, you shall visit the different countries with Jules Galdea as your escort, and be accorded every courtesy and kindness. Whenever you are ready to attempt a return voyage, I assure you that your boat, which is here on exhibition, shall be put in the waters of the river Hydekal at its mouth, and we will bid you Jehovah's speed." Thus terminated our only interview with the high priest or ruler of the continent. We learned that the males do not marry before they are from 75 to 100 years old, and that the age at which women enter wedlock is only a little less, and that both men and women frequently live to be from 600 to 800 years old, and in some instances much older. Josephus says, "God prolonged the life of the patriarchs that preceded the deluge, both on account of their virtues and to give them the opportunity of perfecting the sciences of geometry and astronomy, which they had discovered, which they could not have done if they had not lived 600 years, because it is only after the lapse of 600 years that the great year is accomplished." Flammarion, Astronomical Myths, Paris, page 26. During the following year, we visited many villages and towns, prominent among them being the cities of Neagai, Delphi, Hectia, and my father was called upon no less than a half-dozen times to go over the maps which had been made from the rough sketches he had originally given of the divisions of land and water on the outside. I remember hearing my father remark that the giant race of people in the land of the Smoky God had almost as accurate an idea of the geography of the outside as had the average college professor in Stockholm. In our travels, we came to a forest of gigantic trees near the city of Delphi. Had the Bible said there were trees towering over 300 feet in height and more than 30 feet in diameter, growing in the Garden of Eden, the Ingersolls, the Tom Paines, and the Voltaires would doubtless have pronounced the statement a myth. Yet this is the description of California Sequoia gigantea. But these California giants pale into significance when compared with the forest Goliaths found in the within continent, the North Continent, where abound mighty trees from 800 to 1,000 feet in height, and from 100 to 120 feet in diameter, countless in numbers and forming forests extending hundreds of miles back from the sea. The people are exceedingly musical, and learn to a remarkable degree in their arts and science, especially geometry and astronomy. Their cities are equipped with vast palaces of music, where not infrequently as many as 25,000 lusty voices of this giant race swell forth in mighty choruses of the most sublime symphonies. The children are not supposed to attend institutions of learning before they are 20 years old. Then their school life begins and continues for 30 years, 10 of which are uniformly devoted by both sexes to the study of music. Their principal vocations are architecture, agriculture, horticulture, the raising of vast herds of cattle, and the building of conveyances particular to that country, for travel on land and water. By some device which I cannot explain, they hold communion with one another between the most distant parts of their country on air currents. All buildings are erected with special regard to strength, durability, beauty, and symmetry, and with a style of architecture vastly more attractive to the eye than I have ever observed elsewhere. About 3/4 of the inner surface of the earth is land, and about 1/4 water. There are numerous rivers of tremendous size, some flowing in a northerly direction and others southerly. Some of these rivers are 30 miles in width, and it is out of these vast waterways, at the extreme northern, in regions where low temperatures are experienced, that freshwater icebergs are formed. They are then pushed out to sea like huge tongues of ice, by the abnormal freshets of turbulent waters that, twice every year, sweep everything before them. We saw innumerable specimens of bird life, no larger than those encountered in the forests of Europe or America. It is well known that during the last few years, whole species of birds have quit the earth. A writer in a recent article on this subject says, "Almost every year sees the final extinction of one or more bird species. Out of 14 varieties of birds found a century since on a single island, the West Indian island of St. Thomas, 8 now have to be numbered among the missing. Is it not possible that these disappearing bird species quit their habitation without and find an asylum in the within world?" So I think that right here that he's kind of confusing the much publicly discussed at that time via Darwin, that the extinction of the puffin and other birds in that area that were killed off by sailors, that this is discussed about as an evolutionary thing, and that I think that this author feels that it lends credence to birds going down inside of the earth. So it's just another interesting side note. Whether inland among the mountains or along the seashore, we found bird life prolific. When they spread their great wings, some of the birds appeared to measure 30 feet from tip to tip. They are of great variety and many colors. We were permitted to climb up on the edge of a rock and examine a nest of eggs. There were 5 in the nest, each of which was at least 2 feet in length and 15 inches in diameter. After we had been in the city of Hectea about a week, Professor Galdia took us to an inlet, where we saw thousands of tortoises along the sandy shore. I hesitate to state the size of these creatures. They were from 25 to 30 feet in length, from 15 to 20 feet in width, and fully 7 feet in height. When one of them projected its head, it had the appearance of some hideous sea monster. The strange conditions within are favorable not only for vast meadows of luxuriant grasses, forests of giant trees, and all manner of vegetable life, but wonderful animal life as well. One day we saw a great herd of elephants. There must have been 500 of these thunder-throated monsters with their restlessly waving trunks. They were tearing huge boughs from the trees and trampling smaller growth into dust like so much hazel brush. They would average over 100 feet in length and from 75 to 85 feet in height. It seemed as I gazed upon this wonderful herd of giant elephants that I was again living in the public library at Stockholm, where I had spent much time studying the wonders of the Miocene age. I was filled with mute astonishment, and my father was speechless with awe. He held my arm with a protecting grip, as if fearful harm would overtake us. We were 2 atoms in this great forest, and fortunately, unobserved by this vast herd of elephants as they drifted on and away, following a leader as does a herd of sheep. They browsed from growing herbage, which they encountered as they traveled, and now again shook the firmament with their deep bellowing. Moreover, there were a great number of elephants in the island, and there was provision for animals of every kind. This is another side note. Also, whatever fragrant things there are in the earth, whether roots or herbage or woods, or distilling drops of flowers or fruits, grew and thrived in that land. The Kratiluo of Plato. There is a hazy mist that goes up from the land each evening, and it invariably rains once every 24 hours. This great moisture and invigorating electrical light and warmth accounts, perhaps, for the luxuriant vegetation, while the highly charged electrical air and the evenness of climatic conditions may have much to do with giant growth and longevity of all animal life. In places, the level valleys stretched away for many miles in every direction. The smoky god and its clear white light looked calmly down. There was an intoxication in the electrically surcharged air that fanned the cheeks as softly as a vanishing whisper. Nature chanted a lullaby in the faint murmur of winds, whose breath was sweet with the fragrance of bud and blossom. After having spent considerably more than a year in visiting several of the many cities of the within world, and a great deal of intervening country, more than 2 years had passed from the time we had been picked up by the great excursion ship on the river. We decided to cast our fortunes once more upon the sea, and endeavor to regain the outside surface of the earth. We made known our wishes, and they were reluctantly but promptly followed. Our host gave my father, at his request, various maps showing the entire inside of the earth. Its cities, oceans, seas, rivers, gulfs, and bays. They also generously offered to give us all the bags of gold nuggets, some of them as large as a goose's egg, that we were willing to attempt to take with us in our little fishing boat. In due time we returned to Jehu, at which place we spent 1 month in fixing up and overhauling our little fishing sloop. After all was in readiness, the same ship, Naz, that originally discovered us, took us on board and sailed to the mouth of the river Hiddekel. After our giant brothers had launched our little craft for us, they were most cordially regretful at parting, and evinced much solicitude for our safety. My father swore by the gods Odin and Thor that he would surely return again, within a year or 2, and pay them another visit, and thus we bade them adieu. We made ready and hoisted our sail, but there was little breeze. We were becalmed within an hour after our giant friends had left us and started on their return trip. The winds were constantly blowing south, that is, they were blowing from the northern opening of the earth toward that which we knew to be south, but which, according to our compass's pointing figure, was directly north. For 3 days we tried to sail and to beat against the wind, but to no avail, whereupon my father said, "My son, to return by the same route as we came is impossible at this time of year. I wonder why we did not think of this before. We have been here almost 2.5 years. Therefore this is the season when the sun is beginning to shine in at the southern opening of the earth. The long cold night is on in the Spitzbergen country. What shall we do?" I inquired. "There is only one thing we can do," my father replied, "and that is to go south." Accordingly, he turned the craft about, gave it full reef, and started by the compass north, but in fact directly south. The wind was strong, and we seemed to have struck a current that was running with remarkable swiftness in the same direction. In just 40 days, we arrived at Delphi, a city we had visited in company with our guides, Jules Galdia and his wife, near the mouth of the Gahan River. Here we stopped for 2 days and were most hospitably entertained by the same people who had welcomed us on our former visit. We laid in some additional provision and again set sail, following the needle due north. On our outward trip we came through a narrow channel, which appeared to be a separating body of water between two considerable bodies of land. There was a beautiful beach to our right, and we decided to reconnoiter. Casting anchor, we waited ashore to rest up a day before continuing the outward hazardous undertaking. We built a fire and threw on some sticks of dry driftwood. While my father was walking along the shore, I prepared a tempting repast from plies we had provided. There was a mild, luminous night, which my father said resulted from the sun shining in from the south aperture of the earth. That night we slept soundly and awakened the next morning as refreshed as if we had been in our own beds at Stockholm. After breakfast, we started out on an island tour of discovery, but had not gone far when we sighted some birds which we recognized at once as belonging to the penguin family. They are flightless birds, but excellent swimmers and tremendous in size, with white breast, short wings, black head, and long peaked bills. They stand fully 9 feet high. They looked at us with little surprise and presently waddled rather than walked toward the water, and swam away in a northerly direction. The nights are never so dark at the poles as in other regions, for the moon and stars seem to possess twice as much light and effulgence. In addition, there is a continuous light, the varied shades and play of which are amongst the strangest phenomena of nature. Rambrassen's astronomy. The events that occurred during the following 100 or more days begar description. We were on an open and iceless sea. The month we reckoned to be November or December, and we knew the so-called South Pole was turned toward the sun. Therefore, when passing out and away from the internal electrical light of the smoky god and its genial warmth, we would be met by the light and warmth of the sun, shining in through the south opening of the earth. We were not mistaken. The fact that gives the phenomenon of the polar aurora its greatest importance is that the earth becomes self-luminous, that besides the light which as a planet is received from the central body, it shows a capability of sustaining a luminous process proper to itself. Humboldt. So I think that here he's either become extremely confused, or he has, if this story is true, it could be that someone has told him to come up with this story that they popped out at the South Pole to properly confuse us. Because everything up to that point went with the rest of our research. And then, at the end of it now, it seems to be coming back on itself and destroying itself. Quite common in these let out the information and then destroy it exercises that they do. So carrying on. They're supposed to be at the South Pole now, leaving. But what we'll see is that it sounds more like they were at the North still. There were times when our little craft, driven by wind that was continuous and persistent, shot through the waters like an arrow. Indeed, had we encountered a hidden rock or obstacle, our little vessel would have been crushed into kindling wood. At last we were conscious that the atmosphere was growing decidedly colder, and a few days later icebergs were sighted far to the left. My father argued, and correctly, that the winds which filled our sails came from the warm climate within. The time of the year was certainly most auspicious for us to make our dash for the outside world, and attempt to scud our fishing sloop through open channels of the frozen zone which surrounds the polar regions. We were soon amid the ice packs, and how our little craft got through the narrow channels and escaped being crushed, I know not. The compass behaved in the same drunken and unreliable fashion in passing over the southern curve or edge of the Earth's shell as it had done on our inbound trip at the northern entrance. So I think they're at the north still. They took them back to the river Heidekel and pushed them out. So they wouldn't have taken them somewhere else. It gyrated, dipped, and seemed like a thing possessed, the compass. Captain Sabina on page 105 in Voyages in the Arctic Regions says, The geographical determination of the direction and intensity of the magnetic forces at different points of the Earth's surface has been regarded as an object worthy of special research. To examine in different parts of the globe the declination, inclination, and intensity of the magnetic force, and their periodical and secular variations and mutual relations and dependencies could be duly investigated only in fixed magnetical observatories. So I'll tell you guys a little interesting story there. When you look at aeronautical maps over the Earth for military applications, you'll notice that there's lots of places where they say magnetic variance or magnetic disturbance, and these are huge areas where it's always a large rock piling. When you look at the areas that you'll see this in, it always seems to be a semi-mountainous area that sticks out of the ground and is highly rocky. And you'll see it in the Canadian Shield and in many other places where it's been noted that as they're going over, their compasses will spin for a bit and then go back to normal, or that the declination goes way off because of a strange magnetic variation in that location. So, as we've seen before in other of my documentaries, it's easily explicable as just the changing magnetic pace of the Earth, that the Earth itself is filled with this magnetic force that is not necessarily locked to any position. I'm not talking about the North Pole here. I'm talking about the magnetic net that surrounds us and wraps through us. That there are certain points where magnetic lines will overlap and make small extra magnetic resonances, especially to a compass. Okay, so one day as I was lazily looking over the sloop side into the clear waters, my father shouted, "Breakers ahead!" Looking up, I saw through a lifting mist a white object that towered several hundred feet high, completely shutting off our advance. We lowered sail immediately, and none too soon. In a moment we found ourselves wedged between two monstrous icebergs. Each was crowding and grinding against its fellow mountain of ice. They were like two gods of war contending for supremacy. We were greatly alarmed. Indeed, we were between the lines of a battle royal. The sonorous thunder of the grinding ice was like the continued volleys of artillery. Blocks of ice larger than a house were frequently lifted up 100 feet by the mighty force of lateral pressure. They would shudder and rock to and fro for a few seconds, then come crashing down with a deafening roar and disappear into the foaming waters. Thus, for more than 2 hours, the contest of the icy giants continued. It seemed as if the end had come. The ice pressure was terrific, and while we were not caught in the dangerous part of the jam, and were safe for the time being, yet the heavy heaving and rending of tons of ice as it fell, splashing here and there into the watery depths, filled us with shaking fear. Finally, to our great joy, the grinding of the ice ceased, and within a few hours the great mass slowly divided, and, as if an act of providence had been performed, right before us lay an open channel. Should we venture with our little craft into this opening? If the pressure came on again, our little sloop as well as ourselves would be crushed into nothingness. We decided to take the chance, and accordingly hoisted our sail to a favoring breeze, and soon started out like a racehorse, running the gauntlet of this unknown narrow channel of open water. For the next 45 days our time was employed in dodging icebergs and hunting channels. Indeed, had we not been favored with a strong south wind and a small boat, I doubt if this story could have ever been given to the world. At last there came a morning when my father said, "My son, I think we are to see home. We are almost through the ice. See, the open water lies before us." However, there were a few icebergs that had floated far northward into the open water still ahead of us on either side, stretching away for many miles. Directly in front of us and by the compass, which had now righted itself due north, there was an open sea. "What a wonderful story we have to tell the people of Stockholm," continued my father, while a look of pardonable elation lighted up his honest face. "And think of the gold nugget stowed away in the hold." I spoke kind words of praise to my father, not alone for this fortitude and endurance, but also for his courageous daring as a discoverer, and for having made the voyage that now promised a successful end. I was grateful, too, that he had gathered the wealth of gold we were carrying home. While congratulating ourselves on the goodly supply of provisions and water we still had on hand, and on the dangers we had escaped, we were startled by hearing a most terrific explosion, caused by the tearing apart of huge mountain of ice. It was a deafening roar like the firing of 1,000 cannon. We were sailing at the time with great speed, and happened to be near a monstrous iceberg, which to all appearances was immovable as a rock-bound island. It seemed, however, that the iceberg had split, and was breaking apart, whereupon the balance of the monster along the ice which we were sailing was destroyed, and it began dipping from us. My father quickly anticipated the danger before I realized its awful possibilities. The iceberg extended down into the water many hundreds of feet, and as it tipped over, the portion coming up out of the water caught our fishing craft like a lever on a fulcrum, and threw it into the air as if it had been a football. Our boat fell back on the iceberg, that by this time had changed to the side next to us, for the top. My father was still in the boat, having become entangled in the rigging, while I was thrown some 20 feet away. I quickly scrambled to my feet, shouted to my father, who answered, "All is well." Just then a realization dawned upon me. Horror upon horror. The blood froze in my veins. The iceberg was still in motion, and its great weight and force in topping over would cause it to submerge temporarily. I fully realized what a sucking maelstrom it would produce amid the worlds of water on every side. They would rush into the depression in all their fury, like white-fanged wolves eager for human prey. In this supreme moment of mental anguish, I remember glancing at our boat, which was lying on its side, and wondering if it could possibly right itself, and if my father could escape. Was this the end of our struggles and adventures? Was this his death? All these questions flashed through my mind in the fraction of a second, and a moment later I was engaged in a life-and-death struggle. The ponderous monolith of ice sank below the surface, and the frigid waters gurgled around me in frenzied anger. I was in a saucer, with the waters pouring in on every side. A moment more and I lost consciousness. But when I partially recovered my senses, and roused from the swoon of a half-drowned man, I found myself wet, stiff, and almost frozen, lying on the iceberg. But there was no sign of my father, or of our little fishing sloop. The monster berg had recovered itself, and, with its new balance, lifted its head perhaps 50 feet above the waves. The top of this island of ice was a plateau perhaps half an acre in extent. I loved my father well, and was grief-stricken at the awfulness of his death. I railed at fate that I, too, had not been permitted to sleep with him in the depths of the ocean. Finally, I climbed to my feet and looked about me. The purple domed sky above, the shoreless green ocean beneath, and an occasional iceberg discernible. My heart sank in hopeless despair. I cautiously picked my way across the berg toward the other side, hoping that our fishing craft had righted itself. Dared I think it possible that my father still lived? It was but a ray of hope that flamed up in my heart, but the anticipation warmed my blood in my veins and started it rushing, like some rare stimulant, through every fiber of my body. I crept close to the precipitous side of the iceberg, and peered far down, hoping, still hoping. Then I made a circle of the berg, scanning every foot of the way, and thus I kept going around and around. One part of my brain was certainly becoming maniacal, while the other part, I believe, and due to this day, was perfectly rational. I was conscious of having made the circuit a dozen times, and while one part of my intelligence knew in all reason there was not a vestige of hope, yet some strange fascinating aberration bewitched and compelled me still to beguile myself with expectation. The other part of my brain seemed to tell me that while there was no possibility of my father being alive yet, if I quit making the circuitous pilgrimage, if I paused for a single moment, it would be acknowledgement of defeat, and should I do this, I felt that I should go mad. Thus, hour after hour, I walked around and around, afraid to stop and rest, yet physically powerless to continue much longer. O horror of horrors, to be cast away in this wide expanse of waters without food or drink, and only a treacherous iceberg for an abiding place. My heart sank within me, and all semblance of hope was fading into black despair. Then the hand of the deliverer was extended, and the death-like stillness of a solitude rapidly becoming unbearable was suddenly broken by the firing of a signal gun. I looked up in startled amazement, and I saw less than a half-mile away a whaling vessel bearing down toward me, with her sail full set. Evidently my continued activity on iceberg had attracted their attention. On drawing near, they put out a boat, and descending cautiously to the water's edge, I was rescued, and a little later lifted on board the whaling ship. I found it was Scotch whaler the Arlington. She had cleared from Dundee in September and started immediately for the Antarctic, in search of whales. The captain, Angus McPherson, seemed kindly disposed, but in matters of discipline, as I soon learned, possessed of an iron will. When I attempted to tell him that I had come from the inside of the earth, the captain and mate looked at each other, shook their heads, and insisted on me being put in a bunk under strict surveillance of the ship's physician. I was very weak for want of food, and had not slept for many hours. However, after a few days' rest, I got up one morning and dressed myself without asking permission of the physician or anyone else, and told them that I was as sane as anyone. The captain sent for me and again questioned me concerning where I had come from, and how I came to be alone on an iceberg in the far-off Antarctic Ocean. I replied that I had just come from the inside of the earth, and proceeded to tell him how my father and myself had gone in by way of Spitzbergen and come out by way of the South Pole. Whereupon I was put in irons. I afterward heard the captain tell the mate that I was as crazy as a March hare, and I must remain in confinement until I was rational enough to give a truthful account of myself. Finally, after much pleading and many promises, I was released from irons. I then and there decided to invent some story that would satisfy the captain, and never again refer to my trip to the land of the Smoky God, at least until I was safe among friends. Within a fortnight I was permitted to go about and take my place as one of the seamen. A little later the captain asked me for an explanation. I told him that my experience had been so horrible that I was fearful of my memory, and begged him to permit me to leave the question unanswered until some time in the future. "I think you are recovering considerably," he said, "but you are not sane yet by a good deal. Permit me to do such work as you may assign," I replied, "and if it does not compensate you sufficiently, I will pay you immediately after I reach Stockholm, to the last penny." And thus the matter rested. On finally reaching Stockholm, as I have already related, I found that my good mother had gone to her reward more than a year before. I have also told how, later, the treachery of a relative landed me in a madhouse, where I remained for 28 years, seemingly unending years, and still later after my release how I returned to the life of a fisherman, following it sedulously for 27 years. Then how I came to America, and finally to Los Angeles, California. But all this can be of little interest to the reader. Indeed, it seems to me the climax of my wonderful travels and strange adventures was reached when the Scotch sailing vessel took me from an iceberg on the Antarctic Ocean. Author's afterword. I found much difficulty in deciphering and editing the manuscripts of Olaf Jansen. However, I have taken the liberty of reconstructing only a very few expressions, and in doing this have in no way changed the spirit or meaning. Otherwise, the original text has neither been added to nor taken from. It is impossible for me to express my opinion as to the value or reliability of the wonderful statements made by Olaf Jansen. The description here given of the strange lands and people visited by him, the location of the cities, the names and the directions of rivers, and other information herein combined, conform in every way to the rough drawings given to my custody by this ancient Norseman, which drawings together with the manuscript it is my intention at some later date to give to the Smithsonian Institution, to preserve for the benefit of those interested in the mysteries of the farthest north, the frozen circle of silence. It is certain that there are many things in Vedic literature, in Josephus, the Odyssey, the Iliad, Terrien de la Coupery's Early History of Chinese Civilization, Flammarion's Astronomical Myths, Lenormant's Beginning of the History, Hesiod's Theogony, Sir John de Mandeville's writings, and Sayce's Record of the Past, that, to say the least, are strangely in harmony with the seemingly incredible text in the yellow manuscript of the Old Norseman, Olaf Jansen, and now for the first time given to the world. In concluding this history of my adventures, I wish to state that I firmly believe science is yet in its infancy concerning the cosmology of the Earth. There is so much that is unaccounted for by the world's accepted knowledge of today, and will ever remain so until the land of the Smoky God is known and recognized by our geographers. It is the land from whence came the great logs of cedar that have been found by explorers in open waters far over the northern edge of the Earth's crust, and also the bodies of mammoths whose bones are found in vast beds on the Siberian coast. Northern explorers have done much. Sir John Franklin, de Havilland Grinnell, Sir John Murray, Kane, Melville, Hall, Nansen, Schwatka, Greeley, Peary, Ross, Gerlache, Bernacchi, Andre, Amsden, Amundsen, and others have all been striving to storm the frozen citadel of mystery. I firmly believe that Andre and two brave companions, Strindberg and Franknell, who sailed away in the balloon Orion from the northwest coast of Spitzbergen on that Sunday afternoon of July 1897, are now in the within world, and doubtless are being entertained, as my father and myself were entertained, by the kind-hearted giant race inhabiting the inner Atlantic continent. Having, in my humble way, devoted years to these problems, I am well acquainted with the accepted definition of gravity, as well as the cause of the magnetic needle's attraction, and I am prepared to say that it is my firm belief that the magnetic needle is influenced solely by electric currents, which completely envelop the Earth like a garment, and that these electric currents in an endless circuit pass out of the southern end of the Earth's opening, diffusing and spreading themselves over all the outside surface, and rushing madly on in their course toward the North Pole. While these currents seemingly dash off into space at the Earth's curve or edge, yet they drop again to the inside surface and continue their way southward along the inside of the Earth's crust, toward the opening. Mr. Lemstrom concluded that an electric discharge, which could only be seen by means of the spectroscope, was taking place on the surface of the ground all around him, and that from a distance it would appear as a faint display of aurora, the phenomena of pale and flaming light which is sometimes seen on the top of the Spitzbergen Mountains, from the Arctic. As to gravity, no one knows, because it has not been determined, whether it is atmospheric pressure that causes the apple to fall, or whether 150 miles below the surface of the Earth, supposedly one halfway through, there exists some powerful lodestone attraction that draws it. Therefore, whether the apple, when it leaves the limb of the tree, is drawn or impelled downward to the nearest point of resistance is unknown to the students of physics. The valleys of this inner Atlantis continent, bordering the upper waters of the farthest north, are in season covered with the most magnificent and luxuriant flowers. Not hundreds and thousands, but millions of acres from which the pollen or blossoms are carried far away, in almost every direction, by the Earth's spiral gyrations and the agitation of the wind. And it is these blossoms or pollen from the vast floral meadows within that produce the colored snows of the Arctic regions that have so mystified the northern explorers. Kane, Volume 1, page 54 says, "We passed the crimson cliffs of Sir John Ross in the forenoon of August 5th. The patches of red snow from which they derive their name could be seen clearly at the distance of 10 miles from the coast." Lachambe, in an account of André's balloon expedition, on page 144, says, "On the Isle of Amsterdam, the snow is tinted with red for a considerable distance, and the savants are collecting it to examine it microscopically. It presents in fact certain peculiarities. It is thought that it contains very small plants." Scorby, the famous whaler, had already remarked this. Beyond question, this new land within is the home, the cradle of the human race, and viewed from the standpoint of the discoveries made by us, must of necessity have a most important bearing on all physical, paleontological, archaeological, philological, and mythological theories of antiquity. The same idea of going back to the land of mystery, to the very beginning, to the origin of man, is found in Egyptian traditions of the earlier terrestrial regions of the gods, heroes and men from the historical fragments of Manetho, fully verified by the historical records taken from the more recent excavations of Pompeii, as well as traditions of the North American Indians. It is now 1 hour past midnight. The new year of 1908 is here, and this is the 3rd day thereof. And having at last finished the record of my strange travels and adventures, I wish given to the world, I am ready and even longing for the peaceful rest which I am sure will follow life's trial and vicissitudes. I am old in years, and ripe both with adventures and sorrows, yet rich with the few friends I have cemented to me, in my struggles to lead a just and upright life. Like a story that is well nigh told, my life is ebbing away. The presentiment is strong within me that I shall not live to see the rising of another sun. Thus do I conclude my message. Olaf Jansen.
The descendants of those blonde, tall people whose mummies were found in Egypt, that's why they were
Hi guys, so welcome back to Flatwater Flat Earth. So what's happening is I found some incredible old documents. What this is it's an old book. It's in Latin and I'm in the process of translating it. And I just want to show you guys some of the things that I found in it. This relates to a lot of the stuff that I've been looking at and what Zen Garcia just went into on his most recent show. So this is the 15th of January 2016. So if you can find a show from around that time, it's just his last show that he just aired. And it ties right in with that, and it's some incredible information. So we'll cut right to the chase, and I'll show you what I have here. So, Great Olai the Ninth, Gotham, Ike Episcopi, the Ritua Upsalenses, heathens in the nature, and Virsutus Vigilans, or fight rerum, of the northern peoples, de Biarmia, and position, and by his character, capitalized first. Biarmia, the northern region, whose zenith is actually in the Arctic pole, and this is the same as Horizon, the circle of the equator, which is divided into two equal parts, the zodiac intersecting, brings it about that the day of one half of the whole of the year makes it one, artificial, and the other one half of the night, and so the whole year. There was a natural one, but when the sun never the position of the sphere, under the horizon, repression is more. It seems that he said that they are in continuous day without night, for in every climate the day dawns before the sun above the horizon, of elevated by 18 degrees, according to the opinion of Ptolemy, or according to others to 30 degrees, step by step, that is, by the quantity of one of the latter sign. So far it is appropriate to the nature of the philosopher, is the author of the sphere. But what an added is naughty nature, which ought to govern the Providentiorum Universi conservation. For that it would never have the benefit of as broken by the light of nature granted, is perpetually clouds. Obsuscens, he said, there exists a ray of sunlight for the disabled being of virtue, as to consume the vapors that are lifted up, or to clear it cannot be. Therefore he, the air, is clear, nor is there, nor to take days. This he wanted to say. At the opposite position, Pliny rise and Solon, the two great philosophers, Pliny and Solinus, who on account of the sun's light, continuous, maintain presence, all the unbearable heat of the sun, in danger, so they and he, rashly condemned by nature itself to each other, protrude too much from the cold to excessive heat, they have gone astray, and the others have achieved the opportunity of making an error. And if the providence of God, interior, pondering the nature and moderation, speaking on the reefs, Biarmia double, whirlpool, impagicent, or not. Moreover, Biarmia, according to Saxo-Zealanders, in Viterior, or in Ulteriorum, Spain, in the mountains of Spain are endless, but harmless snow. Pasqua ferocissima ran hot, or ran riot, burning, skilled among them, impassable forests, and forests abound, most abundant in pastures, by beasts uncommon elsewhere, as is the lower of the book, the animals will be shown, numerous in it, on the river, on account of its natural watercourses, and to the ruin, on a strident, persuranter, foamed volume. So they're talking about the North, this is about the North Pole. All of these things, all these words are describing the people and the plants and the things at the North Pole. And trying to tell a story, but it's not clear because it's so roughly translated. So I'm going to work on it, and it's going to come out much better. But you can already see what it's saying here about natural water courses to the whirlpool, and it actually says whirlpool. So listen to this, there's more. But there are some monstrous ulterior or viterior in Biarmia, monstrous people, the novelty of the approach, and impassable. So it's saying that there's monsters and monstrous people at the North Pole, because Biarmia is the pole. The novelty of the approach, so this is about what Zen was talking about, and insurpassable or insuperable danger, obsusus, it is not easy to mortals have proved, for the major part of the journey is very deep snow. And then it talks about animals. Stags teem, the range-a-fairy, constantly obsessed, and if anyone wants to overcome deer whose incredible speed, cuts to saying something else about Jugalibus, about a person, Heminger. So we'll cut back to that. It says, so these with incredible speed, these deer whose incredible speed, superb ice frozen to the top crosses. Okay, yeah, so we'll get back to the deer. Jugalibus, whose greatest the store there is, as with the Italians at our asses, I run, he may instruct. Heminger, satyr. Superb ice frozen to the top crosses. She remembers calling Saxo, Heminger, a satyr woods, symbols of wealth. Preditum, or predatorum, their mansion held. The king has been tamed, to whom motheress suetize, reaching serverum, course. The greatest spoil, enriched by the acquisition of wealth, and Felix escaped. But each of these, however, valleys, plains, distinct crops, so, do not deny it, but inexhaustible plenty of fish and meat. Finding plenty of fish, deer hunting practice ensures that there are great greed, greatly desired function. Now it talks about weapons. So it's giving descriptions of what it's like there, all these different things. Byarmenses fights, arts weapons affecting change, spells, and solve the clouds of heaven, and imbrium spray, used to combine the holiday with a sad-face air. Biarmia idolaters, and more, Amaxobii Scythians, and infascinate people better informed. Of course the eyes, or acts of, or any other thing, a crime, men, they are so bound, so that there be no issue most desirable to the mind to control, sepicu, or saipicu, the extreme thinness impacts, tapishendo, perish, or tapishendo, like taper, perish, you become thin and perish. Solinus in Africa is of the same Pliny, in his tribal wizards kind of testimony, that should intensify extravagant praise upon beautiful trees, colorful corn, charming children, fine horses and flocks, the pasture, and cultivated in the best, should be destroyed on a sudden. So he's saying it's heavenly, could be destroyed on a sudden, but it is of similar maleficence in their delusion, and something instruments, and S instruments lower narrate. And so there's lots that we can draw into. Each of those words is actually a heavy descriptor word that means something else, means something much deeper. So the fact that these words are there, this is, you can see these documents here, Olae Magni, and this is just the beginning of it. So this is where I'm looking into the things that relate to the northern septentrionalis and septentrionalibus, which is the septentrional isles. That's their description for the center island of flat Earth. So again, starting at the start, the Gothic story of the heathens and the nature of the fight of the northern peoples of Biarmia. Biarmia, the position, and by its character, is first. Biarmia, the northern region, whose zenith, so zenith means the center and above, is actually in the Arctic Pole. And this is the same as horizon, the circle of the equator, which is divided into two equal parts, the zodiac, intersecting, brings it about that the day of one half of the whole year it makes artificial, and the other one half of the night, and so the whole year. There was a natural one, but when the sun, never the position of the sphere, so something's lost in here in this translation. But under the horizont, or horizon, repression is more. It seems that, he says, the author of the sphere, the author of the sphere could mean something else, the author of a book, that they are in continuous day without night. And so this is a man describing from the North Pole, that he says that they are in continuous day without night. And then the other guy is saying, for in every climate the day dawns before the sun above the horizon of elevated by 18 degrees, according to Ptolemy, according to others 30 degrees, step by step. That is, the quantity of one latter sign. So he's saying that the sun changes the quantity of 30 degrees, or by the latter, by the amount of one sign. And then they're talking about something about the Garden of Eden, and about being naughty, and which ought to govern men, and sin. And the light of nature is granted. And then it talks about the sun being there perpetually, and yet there being a perpetual mist. Yet there exists a ray of sunlight, being of virtue, as to consume the vapors that are lifted up, or to clear it cannot be. The air is clear, nor is there, nor to take days. And then I think that this is where we have been deceived here about this story of who Pliny and Solinus and who these people really are. What this looks like is that Pliny is a description of the moon and Solinus is a depiction of Sol, the sun, the two great philosophers, Pliny and Solinus, who on account of the sun's light continuously maintain their presence, all the unbearable heat of the sun. And they and he to each other protruded too much from the cold to excessive heat, that they have gone astray, and the others have achieved the opportunity to make up the error. And if providence of God, so it sounds like they're combining the two stories there of Adam and Eve and of the sun and the moon, as though they're the same thing. So here, and then it says moderation, moderation. Speaking on the reefs, Biarmia double, it has two reefs. Whirlpool impogissant. So forests abound, most abundant in pastures by beasts uncommon elsewhere, as is the lower of the book, the animals will be shown. Numerous in it the river, on account of its natural watercourses, and to the ruins, on a strident perseranter foamed volume. So perseranter, it could be on a strident purse run tour foamed volume, or perseranter foamed volume. So there's lots more to be seen in this translation of what will come out of it. But there are some monstrous viterior or ulterior in Biarmia. So in the North Pole there are some monstrous wildlife, or there's some monsters there. Let's see what kind of monsters. Monstrous people. And then it says, the novelty of the approach, impassable, insuperable danger, obsusus. It is not easy to mortals. This has been proved. For the major part of the journey is very deep snow. Or more than that, there's very deep Arctic Ocean and ice pack to get through on the other side. Stags teem the range of ferry. So you guys can see what I mean by this, how incredible this is. There's going to be lots more to come on this. I'm going to continue to translate it, and we'll see where this leads. Thanks for joining me, guys. I'll talk to you soon. In this matter of discovery in hand, and chiefly of these most northerly countries and isles, have caused me, since the last year, to send into diverse places beyond the sea, and to men there in our age rightfully esteemed, to wit the honest philosopher and mathematicians, Gerardus Mercator, and to that learned geographer, Abrahamus Ortelius, whose company also, since my first letter sent over, I have had of late in my poor house at Mortlake, and of the other in my youth, sufficient record is published of our great familiarity. And the chief pith of this chapter will testify the honest and philosophical regards that he had of my earnest request to him, inasmuch as speedily he returned the very principal authority whereupon he fashioned unto us that strange plat of the septentrional islands, that thereby our men, adventurers and discoverers, might understand what account is to be made, credit is to be given to the same description. This then other matter I received from him lately. Folio 265B, April 20, 1577. To the most famous Dr. John Dee, his master and much esteemed patron, at Mortlake on the Thames, near London, with 3 enclosures. The 3 enclosures are some map resources. This is one of them. It's too dark to really see well, but I will include some other ones in this video later on that are much more clear. Folio 266, lines missing. Fearing it would not reach you quickly enough if transmission were delayed, I have written down everything you have about the northern regions, and to these, etc. So Jacobus Schnoinen of Herzogenbusch traveled the world like Mandeville, but described what he saw with better judgment. He wrote in the Belgic language. The ideas about the northern regions which some time ago I extracted from him follow word for word, save for where, the sake of brevity or speed, I have translated into Latin, and if not always his words, I have retained the meaning. Note that it is by experience found that near the North Pole in the very dead of winter time is a continual glimmering twilight. at the least. The farther help of light, the moon's recourse above their horizon being not mentioned. So this is on the left here. These are some of the inset additional information that I'll read as needed. In northern Norway, which is called dusky Norway, there are 3 months of darkness during which there is no sunlight but perpetual twilight. I think we all know about this, about the Arctic sun. This North Norway lies over against the country called the Province of Darkness, or Obscure Province, in Latin, Provincia Tenebrosa. Concerning it, however, there is nothing written in Marco Polo, and the Province of Darkness is the most western bound of the Grand Chance land. And between this province and dusky Norway, there is only 12 miles of sea. From North Norway, you cannot reach the indrawing sea, which lies beyond Greenland, for it lies still further northward. This North Norway stretches as far as the mountain ranges, which encompass the North Pole, and borders on this mountain range for about 17 miles by land. The rest is all sea, and this is the same mountain range which, in folio 266b, comes close, within about 15 French miles, and then stands further off towards the east. And near here, toward the north, those little people of whom there is also mention in the Gestae or Thurii, and their borders on it, besides a beautiful open land. And this land lies between the Province of Darkness and the Province of Bergi. But between each of these provinces and these lands lies an indrawing sea. And this province, the open land, has a mountain border of over 72 French miles by land. These facts and more about the geography of the north are to be found in the beginning of the Gestae or Thurii. The islands adjacent to the North Pole were formerly called Scilii, or perhaps Thule, and now the Septentrionals. Among them is North Norway. And there are many small rivers, some 2, some 1, some 3 keenings wide, more or less, and they're called indrawing seas because the current always flows northward so strongly that no wind can make a ship sail back against it. So keenings are an old measure. We can get into that later as to what. Okay, so it says here a keening was 17 to 20 miles. Again, we have to see what their version of miles are at this time. So back to the indrawing seas. No wind can make a ship sail back against these indrawing seas, and in these latitudes the mountains reach up to the clouds and are almost all rock bare of vegetation, and it is almost always misty and dull weather, and it is well known that beyond 70 or 78 degrees of latitude there is no human habitation. Moreover, this 78th parallel goes in a circle round the Arctic Pole in the form of a high mountain range. So already so far what we have is landmass at the northern pole that's not like what we've had described. It has an indrawing sea and a huge mountain range which wraps around the entire 78th parallel in a circle around the Arctic Pole. So continuing on now, part of the army of King Arthur, which conquered the northern islands and made them subject to him, and we read that nearly 4,000 persons entered the indrawing seas who never returned. But in AD 1364, 8 of these people came to the king's court in Norway. Among them were 2 priests, one of whom had an astrolabe, who was descended in the 5th generation from a Bruxellenses. One, I say, the 8 were sprung from those who had penetrated the northern regions in the first ships. That great army of Arthur's had lain all the winter of 530 AD in the northern islands of Scotland, and on May 3 a part of it crossed over into Iceland. Then 4 ships of the aforesaid land had come out of the north, and warned Arthur of the indrawing seas, so that Arthur did not proceed further, but peopled all the islands between Scotland and Iceland, and also peopled Brockland, which is their name for Greenland. So it seems the indrawing sea only begins beyond Brockland. In this Brockland he found people 23 feet tall, that is to say, of the feet with which land is measured. So they correct this as well later on. This is, I think, just a combination of the wrong verbiage here. When those 4 ships returned, there were sailors who asserted that they knew where the magnetic lands were. So where it says here, in this Brockland he found people 23 feet tall, that will be corrected later. It's 4 feet tall, 23 people. Lacuna, Arthur afterwards put on board a fleet of 12 ships, about 1,800 men and about 400 women. They sailed northwards on May 3 in the year following that in which the former ships had departed. And of these 12 ships, 5 were driven on the rocks in a storm, but the rest of them made their way between the high rocks on June 18, which was 44 days after they had set out. More precisely, some of them made their way. The priest who had the astrolabe related to the King of Norway that in AD 1360 there had come to these northern islands an English Minorite from Oxford, who was a good astronomer, etc. Leaving the rest of the party who had come to the islands, he journeyed further through the whole of the north, etc., and put into writing all the wonders of those islands, and gave the King of England this book, which he called in Latin Inventio Fortunatae, which both began at the last climate, that is to say latitude 54 degrees continuing to the pole. This monk said that the mountain range goes round the north like a wall, save that in 19 places the indrawing channels flow through it, whereof the widest is not above 12 French miles across, the narrowest 3/4 miles, and through the narrowest no ship would be able to go. So what we have here is the monk said that the mountain range that wraps around the North Pole goes around it like a wall, but in 19 places, indrawing rivers or channels flow through it. The widest of these is not more than 12 French miles across. No ship would be able to go back against this current because of the rush of the water. The mountain range is surrounded by sea except in northern Norway, where the Norwegian mountain range reaches it for a width of about 17 miles, and right under the North Star, opposite Norway, there lies a fair level land which is uninhabited, where many beautiful, and then we lose it here, lacuna. In the east there stretches out an arm of land which is nearly all wooded, and narrows continually. The farther north, ? The more so that it is not more than 1 mile wide where it meets the mountain range. Otherwise no land touches the circumference of mountains anywhere, but in many places the sea is so narrow that one can see the far side. Pardon me. And the mountain range covers a breadth of 8 miles, ? And in the whole circle, said the Minorite, there is no habitation except on the east side, where in that narrow land already mentioned there were 23 people not above 4 feet tall, whereof 16 were women. This monk said that in 2 other places further inland he found a great piece of ship's planking and other balks which had been used in big ships, besides many trunks of trees, which at some earlier date had been hewn down, so that he could say with certainty that there had formerly been habitation but the people had now gone, and that the country where they, the gypsies, the pygmies I believe he means, lived was more than 6 degrees broad, that is to say 20 days' journey, and no one could cover the distance on foot. And it was 10 degrees long, that is 33 days' journey. Also there lay there, said he, an indrawing sea of 5 channels, gathered together, which came through the mountain range out of the 19 channels mentioned. And in this indrawing sea is 12 French miles wide, and measures across about 4 days' journey. We have a footnote in Ms. in another hand. Hugo de Hibernia, the Minorite. So that's the name of the gentleman. Note that diverse places like these northern isles are almost within the keening of the mainlands opposite to them, but in no place does it touch. This inhabited place of 10 degrees long and 6.6 degrees broad may have another more artificial exposition than so by days' journals to understand the degrees of longitude. That place about 0.8 degrees of latitude, and so to the reckon 0.3 days journey, and 3/4 upon 1. A day's journey is evidently reckoned as 18 French miles in terms of average land travel. So I'll continue on with their description of the northern pole here, the indrawing seas, the whirlpool, and the magnetic Mount Meru. And at the west of the aforesaid country is another indrawing sea, into which 3 more channels go out of the aforesaid 19. And that channel which they, the ships, I believe are meant, had entered also flowed therein. And all these channels which turn tortuously when they come out of the mountains drive ships immediately ashore. But whatever channels float straight into the innermost seas, into which the 19 channels gather, and these ships must of necessity be carried current-wise, i.e. inwards, and become lost. Also, said this Minorite, these innermost seas number 4, and the one which lies on the west side was quite 34 French miles abroad. And on the other side of this sea was the best and healthiest land in all the north. Also, he said that the sea which lay on the east side could never be frozen, because so many channels united there, and it was narrow besides, so that the current was very strong, but that the one which ran to the west on the west side used to freeze almost every year and remained frozen sometimes for 3 months, and in that land he had seen no signs of habitation. But in a country which lay to the north, opposite it, he had recognized planks of ships and sea trunks. All of these 4 countries are high open lands, i.e. plateaus, except some mountains 4 fathom high. There are many trees of Brazil wood, when this priest with the astrolabe, and it trails off there. So there is much Brazil trees growing here. I'll continue on. In the midst of the 4 countries is a whirlpool, into which there empty these 4 indrawing seas which divide the north. And the water rushes round and descends into the earth just as if one were pouring it through a filter funnel. It is 4 degrees wide on every side of the pole, that is to say 8 degrees altogether, except that right under the pole there lies a bare rock in the midst of the sea. So this would be Mount Meru. Its circumference is almost 33 French miles, and it is all of magnetic stone, and is as high as the clouds. So the priest said, who had received the astrolabe from this Minorite in exchange for a testament. And the Minorite himself had heard that one can see all round it from the sea, and it is black and glistening, and nothing grows thereon, for there is not so much as a handful of soil on it. That was the writing and words of the Minorite, who has since journeyed to and fro 5 times for the King of England on business. They are to be found in a book called Inventio Fortunae, or Fortunatae, of which the Minorite himself was author. The aforesaid priest said also to the King of Norway that in the country where he dwelt not 6 times a year did it rain, and even that was drizzle, lasting not more than 6 or 7 hours. So some other descriptions are much Brazil trees growing here on this most beautiful land of the north, a whirlpool in the midst of the North Pole, about or under the North Pole, the whirlpool being 480 miles over or wide, excepting the diameter of the great rock in the middle. A wonderful, great, and high rock right under the North Pole. I'll show you where I'm reading here. And in the midst of the aforesaid whirlpool. So I'm just going to repeat that so it really sinks in. At the center of our Earth, at the North Pole, what we call the North Pole, the only place that a magnet is pulled towards, being the northern pole itself. There is no southern pull, and therefore no southern pole, as it is Antarctica wrapped around us, an ice sheet wrapped around us. So there is only a pull towards this northern magnetic rock pole. The whirlpool around the magnetic rock and around the North Pole is about 480 miles wide. And so, as we've said, a wonderful, great, high rock rises in the midst. Continuing on with the letter here, wrapping it up, the wind never blows hard enough to drive a corn mill. Furthermore, the air is always cool. And the other 7 that were with him testified that they had also heard such things as he related, said by their elders, but they had never seen them. This is word for word everything that I have copied out of this author, Chnoinen, years ago. Farewell, most learned man, with my most affectionate esteem. 1577, Gerard Mercator, end of translation. So, that's the end of the first, that's the end of the letter from Mercator to John Dee. So there is further documentation of this letter and of the information contained therein. I'll continue on with this now to show you, to lend credence to the flat earth model and to lend credence further to this story as well, to show that it's not just from one letter or from one source. So Dee's first inquiry on the subject of the North had been directed to Ortelius by a letter written in January 1577, which is printed as number 67 in Hessel's Ortelis Epistulae, 1887. In this letter, the writer recalls that his friend had indicated the general expectation of Arctic discoveries from the British people, a matter which he himself had pressed long ago, 1553 to 1556. He was now urging, indeed insisting, that further attempts should be made, and he goes on to mention his researches into what the ancients had said and done in respect of this voyage, as well as his recent preparation of a new nautical manual for the sailors. But his particular inquiry at the moment was for the authority that Ortelius had used for inserting the names of Cape Paramantia, Los Jardinos, and some others on the north coast of North America, names which appeared on no other map. He begged for an immediate answer, for our people are already maturing their plans for the northern seaboard. Last year they merely paid their respects to the Greenland Strait, but they concluded with good reason that the whole shore could be circumnavigated and they could reach the Eastern Ocean that way. There is no record of how Ortelius answered Dee's letter, but he came to England in the spring when he saw William Camden and Richard Hakluyt in London, and came down to Dee at Mortlake on March 12th. 5 or 6 weeks later, Frobisher sailed on his second voyage. In fact, Frobisher was secretly commissioned to look for gold ore and not to search for the Northwest Passage. Meanwhile, Dee had been questioning Mercator as to the provenance of the circular inset of the polar regions which appeared on his Great Wall map of 1569, together with some accompanying legends. The reply he received was dated April 20th, 1577, which is transcribed above. Disappointingly, it provides no fresh clue to the identities of Jacob Chnoinen or the author of Inventio Fortunatae, yet it raises the question, must not the latter have visited Greenland or even Markland, Labrador, in view of the knowledge he displays? And again, what was the version of the Gestae Arthuriae which all parties referred to familiarly, and which contained such strange new detail of that king's enterprises? So is this what has been covered up and hidden from us? Is this why there's a dew line at the North Pole, the Defense Early Warning line? Is this why not only is there an Antarctic Treaty, but the Arctic Treaty, and the recent talk about who is going to control the Arctic? I think in light of our new discoveries or our newfound knowledge of the way that our flat Earth plane functions, that it's definitely not out of the question that if this is at the center of our planet, that this would be something that they might want to hide. Particularly, what would people think if there was a 480-mile wide or 500-mile wide gigantic sucking sound, or gigantic whirlpool sucking all of the world's oceans into a whirlpool at the center of our Earth? I mean, it would be just as scary as people thinking that they would go off the edge of the Earth. And at first glance, it might seem a ridiculous idea, but when you combine it with the other functions of the way that our flat Earth plane functions, the other phenomena that are found there, like the sun spinning around the magnetic pole, it kind of adds more credence to it and kind of makes it make more sense. So this is the map that Mercator made showing this area. So you can see here the Borgi Regio, which is, I believe, Canada, or the northern portions of North America and Canada. This part, you can see the mountain range here that wraps around. I'm sure you've all seen maps like this and ones in color since you've come to the flat Earth. So we have right here the Ocythicus. I don't know if you can see the blue box there. Borgio Regio, kind of North American area. And I guess you can make out the rest of it. You can see the 4 channels that are flowing in here. And Mount Meru, of course, or what can be called Mount Meru, the magnetic lodestone in the center. The gigantic mountain of magnets in the center. Also here you have a little further detail on it and some interesting insertions, such as one word that I find interesting. We still call them the Aurora Borealis, also the Hyperborean or Hyperboreal, and you can see it here, the Hyperborea Europe, Insular Desert, and Anon Phase. I'm not sure what that says actually. Over here, on this portion, you can see that what they've done is this is the full 360, and it's just been opened up, splayed out to add this other information. So what you have here under this blue area is Arcticus, Scythia Intra Imaumontum, and you can see on the bottom there Hyperboreae and Moscovia. So there's Russia, Eastern and Western Europe, and all encompassed in this area here. Russia, Moscovia right here. See if you can see this right here. Moscovia is right in that box there. Okay. Here would be England and Western Europe. And then over here we have Canada and the eastern coast of North America. So all we have, I'm going to continue on now with some further writers who've spoken about this to add credence to this story, that there may actually be a giant hole at the center of our Earth sucking in the oceans. The 8 strangers told King Magnus, and the fact about the Minarite's journeys to and fro after he had written his book, that the book Inventio Fortunatae really existed does not depend on the evidence of Jacobus Schnoinen or Johann Reusch. It does not depend on the evidence of Jacobus Schnoinen because Johann Reusch quoted from it and used it. John Dee made a marginal correction of its title, and it is also casually mentioned by Bartolomé de las Casas in his Historia de las Indias in 1570. When, speaking of floating and burning islands in the Western Ocean, he says that there is mention of the same in the book called Inventio Fortunatae, which shows that he probably read that as well.
A comparison of Mercator's Arctic map with that of Ruysch in the Rome Ptolemy 1508, and with the same region on Beheim's globe of 1492, together with a study of all the map legends side by side with Mercator's letter, makes it possible to reconstruct at the least the basic topographical information contained therein of the Friar's book. Briefly, according to the writer of Inventio Fortunatae, the world's continent was bordered at some distance polewards by an indrawing or insucking sea, which by means of 19 channels broke through a lofty circumpolar mountain range in latitude 78 and 79 degrees. These channels occurred in groups of 3, 4, 5, and 7 respectively, and the 4 groups gathered or flowed into 4 indrawing seas, which all poured into a single central sea about the pole. Excuse me. Here there was a lofty shining black rock of magnetic stone, 33 miles or leagues in circumference, that is to say about 10 miles across, and here the ocean waters swirled round in a whirlpool and were sucked down into the bowels of the earth. The 4 indrawing seas separated 4 land areas, of which 2, as Mercator and Ruysch agree, were inhabited, and 2 not. Mercator puts pygmies or scralings in one of them. Ruysch puts a people called Erumphii, or Arumpheli, who appear also in one of his imaginary Atlantic islands, Fel Erumphili alas Chibes. Beheim, although he shows 19 or perhaps only 18 channels leading from the main ocean, and gives some vague indication of the high mountains, does not completely separate 2 of the 4 land masses, while the pole is masked by the metal axis of his globe. The general resemblance of his outlines is apparent. So the legends on Ruysch's map run as follows. We read in the book the Inventiae Fortunatae that beneath the Arctic pole there is a high rock of magnetic stone 33 German miles in circumference. The indrawing seas around this rock flowing in as if in a vessel that lets water down a hole, i.e. a funnel. There are 4 surrounding islands of which 2 are inhabited, but they are bordered by huge mountains 24 days' journey across, which forbid human habitation. Here the indrawing sea begins. Here the ship's compass does not hold, nor can ships containing iron turn back. In note 1, the high rock is said to measure 33 German miles, units which are 4 times the French miles of the Mercator letter, while the latter on his map writes 33 leagues. This is typical of the current confusion as to measures of length at the time. Mercator, besides, merely calls the rock lofty and black without reference to its magnetic quality, for he had his own theory about the location of the magnetic pole. Ruysch's reference to the upsetting of the magnetic compass may have arisen from his own actual experience of its great variation in the Labrador region, and he also appears to have put his own interpretation on this, and onto the fact that the ships could not turn back once in the indrawing seas. So we'll continue here. Touching the description of the north parts, I have taken the same out of the voyage of James Schnoinen of Hearts of Busk, which allege certain conquests of Arthur, king of Britain, and the most part, the chiefest things among the rest he learned of a certain priest in the king of Norway's court in the year 1364. This priest was descended in the 5th generation from them which King Arthur had sent to inhabit these islands, and he reported in the year 1360 a certain English friar, a Franciscan, and a mathematician of Oxford came into these islands, who, leaving them and passing further by his magical art, described all those places that he saw, and took the height of them with his astrolabe, according to the form that I have set down in my map. And as I have taken it out of the aforesaid Jacob Schnoinen, he said that those 4 indrafts were drawn into an inward gulf or whirly pool, with so great a force that the ships which once entered therein could by no means be driven back again, and that there is never in these parts so much wind blowing as might be sufficient to drive a corn mill. Geraldus Cambronales hath certain words altogether alike with these. Hakluyt follows his translation with a further testimony taken from a summary which Dee had drawn up from Mercator's letter for the information of the Queen. Anno 1360, that is to wit, in the 34 years of the reign of the triumphant King Edward III, a friar of Oxford, being a good astronomer, went in company with others to the most northern islands of the world, and there leaving his company together, he travelled alone and purposely described all the northern islands, with the indrawing seas and the record thereof. At his return he delivered to the King of England, the name of which book is Inventio Fortunatae, Alter Fortunae, qui liber incipe agradu 54 usque ad polum. Sorry, I don't speak Latin, I'm just doing my best with it, bear with me. Which friar, for sundry purposes, after that did 5 times pass from England thither and home again. Mercator has 4 further inscriptions placed on the map itself, which are of assistance in distinguishing the great polar islands described in the letter. They read as follows.
This channel has 5 mouths, entries, and because of its narrow, swift current, it never freezes. Here live pygmies at most 4 feet tall, who are like those in Greenland called skraelings. This channel is entered by 3 mouths and remains frozen for 3 months every year. It's 37 leagues long. This island is the best and healthiest of the whole north. The ocean rushes in between these islands by 19 mouths and makes 4 channels by which it is incessantly carried northwards, and there it disappears into the bowels of the earth. Okay, so it carries on here, and because of whoever has created the rest of this document, they go into further reasons why they do or don't believe it. If you want to get further into that, I will provide a link to this full document. I'm sure quite a few flat earthers have already seen and read this. So here it goes on further about the locations of Friesland, how Friesland was near Iceland and Greenland, further about the visit there of Jacob Schneinen, and it goes on about him being the founder of Christianity in that area. So, and then it continues on trying to give further information which proves or disproves the authenticity of this letter. I'll leave the authenticity of this letter to you to be the judge of that. And what I'll do now is just show you a few more versions of that map, or versions of information that's shown in that map. So we'll start right here. And what we have here is Orbis Terrae Compendiosa Descriptio, which is another Mercator map. Or at least a lot of the information in it is from Mercator, I should say. It didn't turn out as well as I thought it would, but you can see the 2 islands here, and on the other side the other 2 islands, which is a link up. When you look at the accuracy of this map as a whole, you know, in the known parts, you can see that they were not being silly making this map. And so when he put those parts on there, he was not being silly. It is what he believed was there, or knew was there. This is a better version of it. This is just a polar, I wouldn't call it a projection, just a polar map aiming straight down. And you see the Great Northern Sea, Greenland, Baffin's Bay. The pink side on the right side here is North America and the northern part of Canada, and the left side would be Russia and Europe and Asia. We'll carry on. A more recent version, you can see that all the datum is very accurate right up till you get up to the north, and then it's just simply cut off as though we're not allowed to know what is there. This is a picture showing Erythia being raptured or taken by the Boreans. So you can see literature which I don't necessarily or don't at all subscribe to about the hermeneutic interpretation of mankind. But what I think is interesting here is that there's all these links throughout history of the Boreans and the Hyperboreans, and that the people there were very advanced people, that Atlantis and Hyperborea are connected and are the same place. I think this has become an obvious conclusion to a lot of flat earthers who have looked into this side of the research. This is an old Indian, or from India, or from pardon me, Buddhist interpretation of the earth planes and some of its inhabitations. Sorry, it's a Burmese map of the world showing traces of medieval European mapping. Pardon me, Burma, so China. This is just another photograph. Here is another old map that was done by Mercator or assisted by Mercator. And again, you can see the northern polar region showing Groenlandia and other aspects that tie into the last maps that I just showed you. But these maps are nowhere near as good. again here, this is an inset from a very large map. And you can see that it's called the Septentrionalis, the Franciscan. And in the inset here, you can see the further detail of some of these islands and some of the makeup. And again, as soon as you get to that northern pole, that 70 degree, they cut off the information and you're not allowed to see what's up there. Same thing here, it's called the Borealis. So again, the Boreans, Hyperborea. And this is northern Canada. Okay. And as you can see, again, this is from a large world map, which is very accurate when you take the map as a whole. So I don't think that he was adding silliness or make-believe when he created these maps. So, in conclusion, I guess you've seen, I think you've seen what I wanted to show you. I'll add a link at the bottom of this video. And we'll continue on with our learning about the flat earth and the reality of the environment that we live in. I know that this is difficult information. I'm just going to go on a little further about how difficult this information is for people to take in. I've been talking about this stuff with a lot of people, and I see that our indoctrination, because of it beginning at and before our birth, because of us being so indoctrinated since birth, it takes people months, literally months of conscious and subconscious reiteration of this information to come to the conclusion that they are at a flat earth. I love the quotes from the Zetetic Astronomy of Samuel Rowbottom, where he talks about that if people don't know that the earth is flat, it's merely from a lack of knowing about all of the information. Of course, everyone who knows and is a flat earther knows that it's very simple and very easy once they know. You know, water being level is a showstopper. The sun, the earth going around the sun, and the fact that if you trace it out on a piece of paper or trace it out in any way, you'd see that if it were a heliocentric model, the night and day would flip every 6 months. So we flat earthers know that it's flat, and we know how easy it is to know that it's flat. But we have to remember how hard it was for us to come over originally, and how much your mind needed to unbrainwash itself. So that's all I have for now. I'll be carrying on and having further videos about this stuff, I hope, if you guys like it. If not, too bad. I'll thank you for your comments below. Good day. This is a book about the dawn of human civilization. It goes back to a historical period called the Neolithic, the Chalcolithic era. It reflects the story of the oldest civilization known in Europe, called by the broadest term Ancient Europe. This book represents a sensational discovery about the oldest known inhabitants of ancient Europe, whose ethnic name has come to us through the classical ancient writers such as Homer, Herodotus, Pythagoras, Plutarch, and many others. It tells us the story of the rediscovery of ancient Thrace, and the people who were called from times immemorial simply the Thracians. These people were known to Herodotus as the most numerous ethnic group, second only to the Hindus, and to Homer, who wrote his Iliad, as people who reminded him of the gods. I will leave most of the story for others to tell, namely the archaeologists and the historians of the ancient past. My part to tell is only the smallest, yet it must be the most glorious, for it is about one aspect of the lives of these ancient people, the Thracians, that makes them a most unique ethnic group among their neighbors, when all things are taken into consideration. Our modern understanding of history shifts and changes faster than ever these days with the advent of the internet communications era. The reason is apparent: unprecedented free and unhampered access to multiple global information streams, allowing the broadest ever data harvesting and source analysis. Such unique new possibilities are especially relevant to the researching of the most ancient history of the world, since access to the most ancient and unique document sources of the past had also been the hardest to get in previous years, for multiple reasons of various nature. This book redefines what most archaeologists and historians classify today as the prehistoric era, named so to denote a period of time lacking yet a system of writing, and thus signifying that a historical record had not yet been possible. And since this book identifies and decodes writing on artifacts from this time period, making it now historic due to the proven existing written historical record, it shifts the known boundaries of the prehistoric era to at least a couple of millennia earlier in time. Furthermore, from the prehistoric texts decoded in this book, it becomes quite clear that the people who inscribed them were neither prehistoric nor primitive, contrary to the many so-called scientific models of the ancient past, but demonstrated highly sophisticated levels of thought expression, anticipated by modern science for a much later period of modernity. Exactly because of the above, this book may appear quite threatening and paradigm-shifting for some present scientific, historical, archaeological, and anthropological dogmas. Thus, it may trigger negative reactions and oppositions by those readers who remain unprepared for significant set of mind changes, and by those former authoritative figures in science who would rather deny this unique discovery than lose their personal scientific ground and territory. This must not come as a surprise, as it is inevitable that the conclusions resulting from a discovery of this nature will actually turn quite a few basic assumptions in modern science upside down, i.e., unless we understand that things have long been head down and now, being turned around once more, they will actually assume their due and rightful position. We should not forget, therefore, that such turbulent changes have always occurred with the major, more or less revolutionary inventions and discoveries of our time. And this should not only be expected, but also welcomed by the greater part of free-thinking and intelligent people. This is definitely not just another attempt at decoding the plates from Gradishnitsa, the 5th millennium BCE, and Karanovo, the 4th millennium BCE, before Common Era. This book makes all the difference, compared to all previous decades of works, presenting various already discarded suggestions, interpretations, and presumptions, and on and on and on, all failed attempts at decoding any of the engraved signs upon the plates, or even making informed guesses about their meaning. For the first time ever, in the scientific discourse laid out in this book, you will find the complete and final scientific decoding of each and every one of the pictographic signs upon both tablets, and the consequent results are, the least to say, unprecedented and sensational. What is especially unique about the reading of the prehistoric texts from these particular plates is the elegant research methodology used by the author to display, literally before the eyes of his audience, all the linguistic detail and artistry leading to the undisprovable and direct conclusions from the accurate final analysis of the hieroglyphic pictograms in their full meanings rendered. Some of the deciphered words in the text mentioning the name of Thrace and the territory of Thrace since around 7,000 years ago, such as on the plate of Gradishnitsa, as well as the evidence for well-defined Thracian Orphic themes since around 6,000 years ago on the plate from Karanovo, are bound to turn at least a few scientific heads. This is so exactly because until now, no one had dared to conceive that the Thracians could have been autochthonous, or originally native, population in those parts of the Balkans. Since such ancient times, especially because all classical Greek chronicles related the name of their ethnicity to the period of the Bronze Age, which was about a couple of millennia later. What's most astounding yet is the fact that the Thracian pictographic script, now decoded, was found on artifacts, the two plates named above, which are of such antiquity that it is now considered conclusively to be the first and oldest script ever known to mankind, predating the written artifacts from Sumer and Egypt by some extra 2 millennia, or 2,000 years. On top of that, it now becomes evident that it was first developed and used by the Thracians, who have been labeled by historians for far too long as a people of no letters. It is worth mentioning the fact that these people of no letters evidently made use of this most ancient pre-hieroglyphic script for at least a millennium, or more, since the hieroglyphs identified on the plate from Gradishnitsa and the ones identified on the plate from Karanovo have been found to be of the same type of pictographic writing. Therefore, it is very likely that a number of other findings from the same period, which have so far been defined as decorative artifacts, may also turn out to be literary documents, written in the same Thracian script. It will become clear from the discourse in the book that this particular script represents a special type of pre-hieroglyphic, identical in character and similar in style to its later counterpart, and possibly direct descendant, which we all know as Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, famous for style and beauty from its pyramid text specimens of a legendary epoch, notably over 2 millennia newer than that of the Thracian tablets. Some experts in the field may actually be so unprepared for a surprise of this magnitude that they may wish the plates were a fake, specially fabricated by an interested party. Luckily, however, the plates from Gradishnica and Karanovo are not a new discovery, but have been around for several decades and have been thoroughly tested by experts, and their genuineness, as well as accurate dating, have been certified. There have been hints and doubts about the possibility of identifying early pre-writing patterns upon them on numerous previous occasions. However, none such have been agreeably identified or decoded until this present final success. Analysis by authoritative sources have been done in the past, searching for similarities between the signs on the plates and other already known ancient scripts like Linear A, while the findings of others categorically rejected any notion that the signs represented a writing system at all, since they could not identify patterns of repetitiveness in the engravings, which could be the hallmark of any known linear writing system. Notwithstanding their differences of opinion about the nature of the artifacts themselves, however, most writers have agreed that if a type of writing was to be indeed identified on the above named plates, this could bring about a dramatic shift in our modern understanding of the ancient world. Well, mine is the privilege to announce that in the course of my present research, the ancient Thracian script has now been finally decoded and the results are unprecedented and sensational. When no observer exists, who could conduct an observation of the world? This simply means that the observers and their definitions play primary roles for the state of being of the world such as we know it, and the potential for change of the same world is locked in the ability for transformation of these observers and definitions. This is a theorem of irrevocable validity and extraordinary existential proportions for each and every one of us, simply because we are the observers in the individually visible world, or rather worlds of our own lives, whatever the depth or multidimensionality of that state of being of ours may be. Furthermore, the observation definitions, so vital for the resulting state of being of our world, are nothing else but exactly our definitions of this entity of ours. Whatever the depth, width, and height, or other levels of dimensionality this entity of ours may encompass. Such thoughts have always been leading for me and have guided my interest and research in the fields of the human psyche, psychological linguistics, language pictography, and cryptography. In the course of my research of the above in relation to the archetypal characteristics of the collective unconscious, I became deeply involved in the study of several ancient languages and their writing systems, which brought me to the point of realization that pictographic thinking, expression, and writing are integral parts of the human psyche. With that in mind, I have continued for many years now my study of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, among others, like the ancient Chinese and Native American early prototypes, trying to find a common link that would be the first and most archaic way of human expression. For the longest period of my life, I had believed that I had found the ultimate answers to my research hypothesis in the script of the early dynastic period in ancient Egypt, when suddenly I stumbled upon genuine Orphic and early Christian texts which revealed to me a striking new picture of the beginnings of the human civilization. Through them I learned the emotionally moving and exciting revelation that my native land and my native people of Bulgaria were most likely the very cradle of the beginnings of human history, through our most ancient ancestors on the Balkans, the Thracians. With this, my lifetime work project entered its best and highest phase of research yet. Finally, after everything said and confessed to this point, it's about time to reassure my readers in the practical value of all the conclusions and research methods in this book. Many of them they will be able to apply for themselves in their own professional and or personal private lives. Needless to say, I am acutely aware that with this humble work of mine, I am neither producing the final word on the issue of the ancient Thracian script, nor bringing a closure to the thesis of my life's research on the origins of human archetypal thinking and expression. At this particular stage of my work, my goal will be considered adequately fulfilled if I have succeeded just opening the next door to the horizons of new insights and the developing picture of our true origins and meaning. To this, let everyone feel welcome to add more, and especially all honest scientists and colleagues of mine, who are in the privileged position of being able to employ the powerful methodology of transcendent science to the good of all human beings, and our entire anthropomorphic cosmos. I dedicate my work to divine wisdom, to the altar of whom I have offered my creative energies and labors, hoping they will be remembered as a noble spark in the timeless efforts of all human beings, in their quest for the whole, complete, and ultimate truth, and a building block in the tower of knowledge of that truth, which breathes life in all living forms through the ages of the ages. Now, does all that's said so far have anything to do with Thrace and the decoding of the Thracian script at all? Why, yes, it does. It has everything to do with it, and the following explains just why it does. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Matthew 6:22 and 23. And again, for as the eye of one is able to perceive, so is that person altogether. Ecclesiastes. So just how do we perceive our most ancient ancestors? Are we prone to seeing them as primitives, slaves of nature, illiterate Neanderthals? In this regard, we have been so brainwashed by years and years of scientific Darwinist propaganda that we have almost forgotten that the theory of evolution was only recently developed hypothesis, and for thousands of years prior to that, the most enlightened minds of our civilization were absolutely confident that mankind descended from God and was divine in nature. Never had it passed through their minds to humiliate and devaluate humanity so much as to propose that we were the descendants of apes. The Thracian king Zer in Egypt. Here's just one of a number of secret Orphic texts which relates to the supremacy of the Thracian culture, religion, and science in the then world. Because from the time of that descendant of the dynasty of the first Tiras, who was named after his father, namely King Tizer, or Tzer, for that's how his name was read in the Thracian speech, a new dynasty was established in Egypt, when the Thracian ships dropped anchor and debarked at the Nile Delta, where the first capital of Egypt, at Buto, was founded. Thus Thrace brought about the beginnings of the first dynasty of Egypt, and inseminated and impregnated the land of Egypt with the ancient speech and writing. For the script of Thrace was the ancient speech, with whose imaginary signs, which are from Eden, and which were later received and stylized by all of the Egyptians. The secret chapters of the second epistle of Melchizedek, 1, 10, and 11. The book of the Thracian epistles. The city foundation, Sophia, 2005. Another similar account of the ancient Thracians is recorded by the Roman historian of Jewish descent, Josephus Flavius, who wrote, Now Tiras, the son of Japhet, called the people over whom he ruled Thracians, or Thracians, but the Greeks later changed the name, calling them Thracians. Antiquity of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 6, 125, The Works of Josephus, translated by William Whiston, A.M., Hendrickson Publishers, 1987. Following historical records like the above, I decided to check them out for veracity and prove them either right or wrong. They sounded both curious and intriguing, and at the same time arousing a great deal of skepticism in regards to the facts of their record. So I had a lot of mixed feelings about spending valuable time on finding out the facts. Nevertheless, soon the ambition of the obstinate researcher in me won over the hesitation about the validity of the whole issue, and a final decision to proceed with the project was reached. The idea that fascinated me the most was, what just if the above obscure pieces of record about the Thracians proved to be a sound historical fact? This could change the whole picture of what we think we know about the earliest inhabitants of Europe, the Thracians. It was definitely worthwhile checking it out. After all, these same ancient Thracians were most likely the common ancient forefathers for the largest part of the whole continent of Europe. So the question I placed at the start of my research was the following. Was there anything in common between any ancient texts ever found on artifacts in Egypt and any artifacts ever found in the land of ancient Thrace, most of which is in modern Bulgaria? My problem was knowing where to begin, or what to begin with, for that matter. One major thought kept pressing in, as the possible clue. Well, let's begin with the Thracian king Zer. To do that, I had to search for any registered events of an expedition, according to my source quoted above, of a king of such a name in the early texts of ancient Egypt. In this discourse, I will save my audience the time and effort I had to spend in digging out material and information in libraries and through my scientific friends and correspondents around the world, as well as the inner controversies and arguments pro and against waging a little big war inside my own mind and soul in the quest for finding the truth. Here's the end result from a long search and the final answer to the puzzle. Yes, there is a king by the name Zer, but its anglicized version is spelled out Jer, or Djer, and so the Egyptologists say at least. That's it, Djer, first dynasty, the old kingdom of ancient Egypt. Is there anything ever written about him in the Nile Delta, in the capital of Buto, on any artifact ever found in Egypt? Yes, indeed. An ivory plate at the British Museum, dated by scientists to around 3000 before Common Era, with the following scholarly description. A plate from Abydos, referring to Djer's journey made to the Delta city of Buto, one of Egypt's early capitals. This plate of Djer is not only an important piece of evidence supporting our hypothesis, prompted by the Orphic text analyzed above, but it turns out to be such a good specimen of very early ancient Egyptian writing that it would be an invaluable tool for comparison with any similarly ancient and possibly equally primitive or rather primordial type of writing. That could be its progenitor in Thrace, or anywhere else in the world for this matter, if our Orphic lead proves itself to be true. But let's look at the Djer plate itself now. Our attention inadvertently focuses on the very primitive, or rather archaic, way in which the pictographic signs have been engraved. Then we try to pinpoint and identify the hieroglyphic of the name of Djer. We need this hieroglyph for a very special purpose. Remember what was written about his ancestral predecessor, bearing the same name as him, by the Roman historian Josephus. Now Tiras, i.e. Tezer, the son of Japhet, called the people over whom he ruled Tiresians, but the Greeks later changed the name, calling them Thracians. Antiquity of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 6, 1. The works of Josephus, translated by William Whiston, A.M. Hendrickson, Publishers, 1987. Now, if we have correctly pinpointed the source and found out the ancient hieroglyph of the name of Tezer, now judging from the above quote from Josephus, it could mean only one very important thing for our whole research. We have found the ancient hieroglyph, meaning not only Tezer, but also Thracian and Thrace. For according to Josephus, they are all but derivatives of that king's name. For a better analysis, in addition to the picture of the Djer plate above, we can also review the schematic presentation of the Djer plate, as published in Peter Clayton's book, Chronicle of the Pharaohs, page 22, courtesy Thames and Hudson, 1994. This is a quite clear schematic drawing of the plate, which allows you to discern a few very important details. There are 4 visible rows of pictograms, hieroglyphs, on this schematic presentation of the plate, kept at the British Museum, among which you can immediately identify the picture of a ship, the pictogram of the city of Buto, and the hieroglyph of the name of King Djer, and a sarek. Now, the sarek is a decorative element surrounding all royal names, and is a form of etiquette meaning His Majesty or His Royalty. Come on, let's pinpoint this particular pictographic sign. Let me help you some. Look in the upper left corner of the plate. Here it is, the invaluable Djer sign in the sarek. And what you see is up in the top left here with this bird sitting atop the box with 3 strokes, 3 bars with a stroke through it, and then on the bottom a set of 4 bars. And as we already know from all said in this book so far, this is also the hieroglyph for Thrace and Thracian. It is not quite clear why this particular hieroglyph is found in one spot of the same text, drawn this way, and it appears as 4 T's, and in another way, that way, where it's 4 T's with the bar across midway. Not even mentioning the fact that it is also found in other texts from ancient Egypt, where it has been drawn in a variety of other versions, like the following few. 4 bars with a dash in the center, 4 bars with a dash in the center italicized with a bit of an edge on the end of it, 4 bars with a dash through the center and turned on a 45-degree angle, 3 bars that end up looking like pylons or skinny pyramids, 3 bars that are pylons or pyramids with a bar across the top, or 5 bars with a bar on top. One explanation may be that in ancient Egyptian writing, these varieties add specific attributes to the main ideogrammic or ideogrammic or phonetic value of the pictogram. For Tezer, Tiras, or Thrace, Thracian, which added attributes in the above given cases have the following respective meanings: the 4 pillars of the world, the backbone of the world, the spinal column, the divine words, scepters, the land of divine words, and megaliths or megalithic temples. Wow, is that ever amazing? It's the 4 pillars. As a result of our findings about the Djer plate kept at the British Museum, now we have acquired a pretty good idea of what to look for among similar artifacts found in Thrace, modern-day Bulgaria. Let us begin our search with the simplest and most logical thing to look for: the pictogram meaning Thrace itself. Since we have already identified its presence in ancient Egypt, isn't it just logical that it should be an even more common finding in the land of Thrace itself? Yes, indeed, and so in fact it is, as there are quite a few examples of its presence in present-day Bulgaria. For the purposes of our specific research in this book, we will focus our attention on just 2 such findings, providing the use proving the use so far of at least 2 of the above listed versions of the pictograms of Thrace, which relate to the temple and liturgical traditions of ancient Thrace at the dynastic and start level. 1. The hieroglyph, meaning Thrace, with strong temple and megalithic connotations, is the central emblematic design widely present at the Royal Thracian Funerary Complex at Sveshter in Bulgaria. At this magnificent architectural structure, the above pictogram of Thrace can be seen stylized as the Thracian triglyph, royal emblem, repetitively integrated in an ornamental sculptural frieze, above the cherubic, caryatid female guardians of the monarch, thus reflecting the state importance of this particular temple funerary complex as a national holy shrine of Thrace. In our second example, the Thracian hieroglyph, with the 3 pyramidal parts, making it so that it's the 4 bars of the outer part. In our second example, the Thracian hieroglyph, and its version signifying that Thrace is the land of divine words, has been often identified as part of the rich ornamentation upon silver and gold sacred vessels from the famous Thracian treasures found at many archaeological sites in Bulgaria. A more detailed analysis of the role of the sacred vessels of Thrace in the ancient liturgical practices and invocations is presented later in this summary and in chapter 10 of this book. The same hieroglyph was probably also the precursor of the very peculiar shape in Thracian I letter M in the Cyrillic phonetic alphabet, developed much later, of course, which is still in use in Bulgaria and other Slavic countries. And the letter, it appears as an M or as 3 T's connected together, and very sweeping and formed in style. Now, since we have acquired a pretty good idea of what to look for, let us continue our search for other artifacts found in Thrace, modern-day Bulgaria, like, let's say, plates or tablets that may contain similar findings to those of the already analyzed De Geer plate kept at the British Museum. Have there ever been found any such so-called plates or tablets anywhere in the land of Thrace? Yes, indeed, quite a few. However, archaeologists have defined the finds as clay decorative appliques, pintadera seals, used for imprinting decorative designs upon pottery. Pictographic interpretation may be possible from the Thracian Atlantis Book 1, page 129. Authors Peter Detev and Jordan Detev, Bulgarian Multimedia Society of 2002. Now let us remember that we already learned from the principles of transcendent science about the exclusive role of the observer in any research platform. The problem which any observer faces is the proven by practice fact that each reality can be perceived only based on the perception and idea models. Okay, fair enough. For as the eye of one is able to perceive, so is that person altogether. In other words, if a researcher starts out on the look for decorative pintaderas, he will most likely see in most tablets nothing else but more or less decorative pintaderas. This is why the starting hypothesis of the researcher is #1 determinant for his correct scientific perception and for the final results and conclusions of his work. Now let's pick a decorative pintadera or 2 from the Thracian Neolithic era and start looking for something more than decorative elements, and see if there are any similarities perchance between the decorations on them and the pictographic signs from the De Geer tablet at the British Museum. A good pick for the purpose turned out to be 2 of the more famous finds of the pintadera type. First, because their numerous pictures had already hit the press for a few decades now, and secondly because they had been found by archaeologists hundreds of miles apart, one in the Vratsa district of Bulgaria and the other in the Nova Zagora district of Bulgaria, and they had already been dated by experts for a time origin of about 1,000 years apart, from the 5th and 4th millennium BCE respectively. The above-mentioned peculiarities made a lot of sense for our pick, exactly because their facts would help us eliminate any possibility for so-called exclusiveness of the object of our research. That term would apply if all the artifacts found were representative of one spot or one place only in a moment of time in history, which would automatically negate the validity of our research. In other words, the tablet from Gradisnica and the tablet from Karanovo presented an almost ideal opportunity for analysis of 2 quite separate in time and space artifacts, which both contained engraved designs upon them, which looked from the beginning promising in terms of our hypothesis that they may contain some pictographic signs. In addition to that, however, they both were great candidates for our research, in terms of validity of whatever results came out in the end, as the 2 tablets could be viewed as representative of the larger area and time framework of a land perimeter halfway across Bulgaria, and at a time perimeter of about 1 whole millennium, or 1,000 years, from 5,000 BCE to 4,000 BCE. Now that we have already made our choice about the material objects of our research, let's begin examining them from different angles, turning them all possible directions, trying to identify any possible patterns of writing. No matter how hard we try, soon we have concluded the obvious, and you can surely come to the same conclusion, that there are no letter signs belonging to any known linear alphabet on either tablet. No Greek, no Phoenician, no Arabic, no Hebrew, etc. No alphabetic linear letter. The same cannot be said about possible pictographic signs, however, because from the very start, a few very primitive or rather archaic primordial drawings of non-stylized figures of men immediately capture the eye, and remind us of the quickhand or shorthand writing signs the ancient Egyptian scribes often used, instead of drawing the full graphics of the corresponding hieroglyphic pictograms. Some examples of such simplified hieroglyphs are presented here for your review, and you see them here. The stylized man instead of the man crouching, and this stylized version of the man instead of a warrior. It's a man holding a shield instead of the full warrior, and then this stick man holding his bag instead of this hobo over here. So far so good, however, this is not enough to reach any conclusions yet. Unless we are able to identify a lot more than just a few drawn, isolated figures on our tablets, all our efforts so far will have been prematurely ended with no significant results. It is precisely so, because unless there is some sort of syntax and or meaningful context connection between all the different primitive signs already picked up by our vision, there can be no pictographic text, but just a few decorative drawings, which would confirm that we are dealing simply with decorative pintaderas. Luckily, my efforts paid off this time. The multiple pictographic signs that became gradually discernible in front of my very eyes upon each of the plates started literally shaping into something so full of richness of content, contextual integrity, that it soon revealed a congruent ancient text of such power that it subdued my whole being to wonder and speechless awe, lasting for days, in view of the eternal meaning of this profound message. I am absolutely convinced that reading the next few pages, you will also be captivated by the same unspeakable sensation of being touched by the eternal spirit of divine wisdom that I felt touched by at my very first encounter with the words of the timeless messages left for us by our great ancestors some 4 and 5 millennia ago, on humble pieces of clay, which nevertheless survived for us to read today. Behold, the first decoded tablet from ancient Thrace is right in front of your eyes now. The votive tablet from the village of Gradishnitsa, the Neolithic Chalcolithic era, circa 5000 BCE. The tablet from Gradishnitsa contains 4 rows of pictographic signs, which are quite clearly visible upon the tablet's pictograph. They are presented in a computer-enhanced version and in a schematic drawing, respectively in Exhibits B and C. If there have been any other additional signs on the artifact that are presently not visible or discernible, these have not been taken into consideration for the purposes of our present reading of the text. The above identified pictographic signs look exactly like the hieroglyphic inscription presented as Exhibit D, when they are transcribed using the stylized later version of the pictographic script, known to us from the pyramid texts of ancient Egypt, beautifully rendered here in its computerized calligraphic print. Upon comparison, it becomes evident that the text displayed on Exhibit B, Exhibit C, and Exhibit D is absolutely one and the same identical text, and that the 2 calligraphic styles, respectively the early Thracian and the late Egyptian, represent one and the same identical pictographic script, which has come to us down the ages in its condition and appearance as seen on Exhibit A. The evident conclusions are as follows. The script used in the engravings upon the tablet of Gradishnitsa found in the land of ancient Thrace, and the scripts used in similar tablets and in the pyramid text found in ancient Egypt, represent one and the same identical hieroglyphic script. The tablet from Gradishnitsa, found in the land of ancient Thrace, predates similar artifacts found in Egypt by at least 2 millennia. Apparently this particular type of hieroglyphic script had originated and was first used in ancient Thrace, and it was later transferred and introduced in ancient Egypt. The early Thracian version of this hieroglyphic script was evidently used quite sparingly, predominantly as the sacred language of the initiated elite. It doesn't appear from the findings so far that it ever reached the levels of widespread utilization, which it found thousands of years later in its late Egyptian version. And here you see the tablets. The original and the computer enhanced, and the schematic. and the computer schematic. The hieroglyphic text upon the tablet from Gradisnitsa can be read in the right to left direction, and its translation has the following or similar meaning, verse by verse. The three one God, Trinity or gods, encompasses, dwells in Thrace. O God, who are dwelling in the territory of Thrace. I witness to the truth, I give offerings to the great Son of God, or I promise to give offerings to the great Son of God. I glorify the great God, and I will praise you, O great God. The temple of God is a great fortress and a secret defended place. O God, who are in your temple, be my fortress and defend me. Deliver me from the enemy. And if we're to put the above text into our everyday lingo of our modern times, it might sound something like this. O three one God of the land of Thrace, I vow in truth to bring you all due offerings, O great Son of God, and only you shall I praise and exalt, O my God, for you are great. You who are now in your temple, I pray, hear me, keep me safe, and deliver me from all evil. From a technical linguistic point of view, it is worth noting here that the above text does not give us adequate clues as to the phonetic pronunciation of the Thracian words in it, or any information about exact phonetics or grammatical natures. But from the signs used on the tablet, only the hieroglyphic symbol meaning to or unto, as in give to or give unto, has a phonetic value of the linear alphabetic letter N, and is read N or N in the ancient Egyptian language. All the rest of the hieroglyphic signs engraved on the tablet are only ideograms in nature, and therefore their pronunciation could be identical to, similar to, or entirely dissimilar to that of ancient Egyptian speech. This very nature of the ancient pictographic script evidently placed it in the position of being the ideal universal international language among the initiated elites, simply because even people who had very different and unintelligible to each other spoken languages could still use this pictographic script as perfectly practical and intelligible means of communication between themselves. Very much the same way as we nowadays use the international road signs for the purposes of regulating road traffic and global transportation, or I'd say planar transportation. The sacred tablet from the village of Karanovo, the Nova Zagora district, circa 4000 BCE. This tablet contains 2 rows of pictographic signs, separated by a horizontal line, each one of which is quite clearly visible upon the tablet's photograph. The same are presented in computer-enhanced versions and in schematic drawings, each respectively in Exhibits B and Exhibit C. Please note that the signs engraved under the horizontal line are inverted, i.e. head down, and the tablet needs to be turned 180 degrees around to full diametrical opposition so that the reading of the second row of text can be accomplished. After the above rotation, the second row of the engraved pictograms is presented below and its corrected upright position for easier reading. Now all of the above identified pictographic signs look exactly like the hieroglyphic inscriptions presented in the exhibits when they are transcribed, using the stylized later version of the pictographic script, known to us from the pyramid text of ancient Egypt, and beautifully rendered here in its computerized calligraphic print. Upon comparison, it becomes evident that each of the rows of text displayed on exhibits B, C, and D is absolutely one and the same identical text, and that the 2 calligraphic styles, respectively the Thracian and the late Egyptian, represent one and the same identical pictographic script, which has come to us down the ages in its condition and appearance as seen on Exhibits A. The evident conclusions, just like in the previous case, are as follows. The script used in the engravings upon the tablet of Karanova found in the land of ancient Thrace are the same scripts used in similar tablets found in ancient Egypt, and are identical hieroglyphic script. The tablet from Karanovo, found in the land of ancient Thrace, predates similar artifacts found in Egypt by at least 1 millennium. Apparently this particular type of hieroglyphic script had originated and was used first in ancient Thrace, and was later transferred and introduced in ancient Egypt. The early Thracian version of this hieroglyphic script was evidently used quite sparingly, predominantly as the sacred language of the initiated elite. It doesn't appear from the findings so far that it ever reached the levels of widespread utilization which it found thousands of years later in its late Egyptian version. The hieroglyphic text upon the tablet from Karanovo can be read either in the right to left or in the left to right because of the symmetrical position of the pictograms around a central axis. Its translation, following the well-established rules for translating Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, has the following or similar meaning, verse by verse. The earthly human realm is separated by the grave, and the guardian of the resurrection between the living and the dead, from the fiery divine realm. Through the mystery of death and resurrection, the earthly human becomes a divine being. Falsehood, a lie, and injustice reigns in the lower earthly realm, while truth and justice reigns supreme in the upper divine realm. The one who has been initiated has exchanged his crown of the lower realm for the high crown of the upper realm, and has passed from falsehood into truth, ruling with the high priestly scepter of truth and justice, now firmly in his hand. If we were to put the above text into the everyday lingo of our modern time, it would sound something like this. Whosoever has been initiated in the mystery of death and resurrection, he has been born anew, and his new nature is divine. He has left all falsehood and has come to know the truth. He now reigns in justice and truth, with the scepter and crown of the upper realm being the ruler of both the upper and lower worlds. Just as before, from a technical linguistic point of view, it is worth noting that the text does not give us adequate clues to the phonetic pronunciation of the Thracian words, or any information about phonetics, but that the signs used can be used to decipher the meaning. The text of the tablet from Caranovo inevitably brings to memory the documented text from a couple of other tablets written in Linear Greek over 3,000 years later. They are known as the Orphic Ivory Tablets from Olbia, tablet number 1 and 2 out of 5, discovered in 1951 and carbon dated around 500 BCE. A detailed description of the Olbia tablets is found in the book The Thracian Dionysios, Invocation and Faith, New Bulgarian University, Sofia 2002, by Professor Alexander Foll, who wrote the following. The first one of the 5 tablets is engraved with the text formula Life, Death, Life, Truth, and Iopoikoi is visible under that formula. Interpreted from its ethnic Orphic language, it brings forth the revelation that life is death, and death is life in the beyond, where true knowledge, truth, is to be found, i.e. death reveals and opens the way to true knowledge. All hesitation is gone upon examination of the second tablet. One of its sides reads, Peace, War, Truth, Falsehood, and below that row, Ion. The revelation is now complete, stating that true knowledge, found beyond death, is also peace, in opposition to war and falsehood, which are contrary to the Orphic teaching. The pictographic vocabulary of the words used in the text from the Thracian tablet and some related ideograms.
The latitude of Thule or Iceland would be fixed at 66 degrees north, which corresponds with the north of Iceland, where the 2 tropics would join and become one. To the foregoing may be added another criticism on Strabo, which has an effect opposite to that intended as, and here we arrive at the Merkaba, which has an effect opposite to that intended as the, quote, marine sponge. Now they say it's nothing but soft ice which forms in the north, but it's described here by Pliny and Strabo as, it is likewise he who describes Thule and other neighboring places where, according to him, neither earth, water, nor air exist separately, but a sort of concretion of all these resembling a marine sponge. Now, I don't know why they throw that in there, but let's just cut that out. So we'll start again. A place where, according to him, neither earth, water, nor air exist separately, but all together, as a sort of concretion of all these, in which the earth, the sea, and all things are suspended, thus forming, as it were, a link to unite the whole together. It can neither be traveled over nor sailed through.
Of how great our African ancestors were. It's the one that boggles everyone's minds. The mystery of the pyramids. The mystery of the pyramids. I think it's important that if we want to deal with Kemet, we would have to know the secrets of Kemet, right? We would have to know the things that are mysteries of the mind to the layperson, right? And one of them would be how the pyramids got there. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Make sure you hit the thumbs up button. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. Share it to your Facebook feeds, family, friends, so on and so forth. This is a powerful lesson. I'm going to go ahead and put this on Facebook now. Because I think